Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Night Story, and welcome to tonight's journey toward peaceful sleep. If you're enjoying this content, I would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like this video. I'd also love to hear from you. Please feel free to share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your kind support truly helps me continue creating these relaxing experiences for you. Now please make yourself comfortable as we gently begin tonight's journey to restful sleep. 5 years ago, when I was 28, my girlfriend Julia and I decided to challenge ourselves with the southern portion of Virginia's Appalachian Trail. At that point, we considered ourselves experienced hikers, having conquered several other segments of the famous path during our 3 years together. This particular stretch, approximately 166 miles winding through George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, from Roanoke County to Pearisburg in Giles County, represented exactly what we were seeking: isolation, natural beauty, and the satisfaction of accomplishing something few casual hikers attempt. "It's probably the most remote section we'll ever do," Julia said, spreading the topographical maps across our dining room table. Her auburn hair fell across her face as she traced possible routes with her index finger. "That's the appeal, right? Getting away from everything?" I nodded, studying the contour lines that indicated steep climbs and descents. "That's why I love these trips with you. Just us and the wilderness." Our apartment in Richmond felt increasingly constraining as autumn approached. Both of us worked demanding jobs, Julia as a hospital administrator and me as an environmental consultant. The stress accumulated gradually, like sediment in a stream, until we could feel it weighing on our relationship. These extended hiking excursions had become our remedy, our way of reconnecting with each other and disconnecting from everything else. "We should plan for 12 days, I suggested, calculating distances between resupply points. "That gives us some buffer if the terrain slows us down." Julia's green eyes sparkled with the excitement that always preceded our adventures. "Perfect. Mid-October would mean fewer people and spectacular foliage." What we didn't discuss, what we never really acknowledged, was the inherent danger of such isolation. We'd encountered our share of challenges on previous hikes: unexpected weather, minor injuries, equipment failures. These problems seemed manageable, even part of the experience. We prepared accordingly with first aid supplies, emergency communication devices, and appropriate gear. I also carried protection, a 1911 handgun, and a Taurus Judge revolver. Julia sometimes teased me about this precaution, calling it my wilderness insurance policy, but never objected. When you're days away from civilization, the thin veneer of societal safety dissolves. Most hikers understand this truth without dwelling on it. The wild can be beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. As October approached, we assembled our gear methodically. Every item underwent scrutiny for weight and necessity. We dehydrated meals, packed layers for fluctuating temperatures, and tested our equipment repeatedly. The night before departure, we sat on our balcony with glasses of wine, watching the city lights flicker below. "What do you think we'll remember most about this trip?" Julia asked, leaning against my shoulder. "Probably something unexpected," I replied. "It's always what you don't plan for that stays with you." I had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. We arrived at the Virginia Creeper Trail Junction on October 12th, a Tuesday morning painted with autumn's most vibrant palette. The air carried that distinctive fall crispness, cool enough to energize without chilling. Sunlight filtered through red and gold leaves, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. Perfect hiking conditions. After a final equipment check and a quick selfie to commemorate the start, we shouldered our packs and began our journey northward. The trail started gently enough, with moderate terrain that allowed us to find our rhythm. Julia walked ahead initially, her teal backpack swaying slightly with each step. "We should document all the different mushrooms we see," she called back, already stopping to photograph a cluster of orange fungi erupting from a fallen oak. Her enthusiasm for botanical details contrasted with my preference for sweeping vistas, a complementary difference that enhanced our travels. That first day passed pleasantly as we covered nearly 12 miles. Our muscles remembered the familiar burn of sustained hiking, and conversation flowed easily between periods of contemplative silence. We encountered only two other hikers, a retired couple from West Virginia who were completing their fourth section of the Appalachian Trail. "Nice stretch ahead," the husband advised as we parted ways. "But watch for the descent into Powell Valley. It gets slick when wet." By late afternoon, we established our first campsite near a small stream that provided both water and the soothing background music of rippling currents. The routine came back naturally, Julia filtering water while I secured the tent, then working together to prepare our campfire. After dinner, rehydrated beef stew that tasted better than it had any right to after a day of hiking, we sat shoulder to shoulder watching flames dance and collapse into glowing embers. "I already feel different," Julia said, her face illuminated by the firelight. "It's like everything back home exists in another dimension now." I understood exactly what she meant. The demands and deadlines that had seemed so urgent just days ago now felt trivial compared to the immediate concerns of shelter, food, and navigation. This mental shift was precisely why we subjected ourselves to the physical demands of these trips. That night, we slept soundly in our tent, the temperature dropping just enough to make our shared sleeping bag cozy rather than uncomfortable. The forest sounds, distant owls, rustling leaves, occasional cracking branches, formed a familiar lullaby that eased us into deep, restful sleep. The next 3 days followed a similar pattern. We averaged 11 miles daily, adjusting our pace to accommodate more challenging sections. The trail took us across babbling creeks, through dense hardwood forests, and occasionally to overlooks offering breathtaking panoramas of valleys consumed by autumn fire. We spotted deer, wild turkeys, and once, from a respectful distance, a black bear with 2 cubs foraging in a berry thicket. Our bodies adjusted to the routine, muscles adapting to the daily strain. Conversation between Julia and me grew increasingly philosophical as the mental noise of civilization faded. We discussed future plans, childhood memories, and the peculiar psychology of voluntary hardship. These were the conversations I treasured most. Unforced, unhurried, and impossible to have amid the distractions of normal life. On our 4th night, camped at the edge of a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the first hint of unease entered our journey. Nothing dramatic, just an inexplicable feeling that prickled at my subconscious. While gathering firewood, I repeatedly glanced over my shoulder, convinced I'd heard footsteps that didn't align with the natural forest rhythm. "Everything okay?" Julia asked when I returned to camp with arms full of branches. "Yeah," I responded, hesitating. "Just getting used to the deeper silence out here." I didn't mention my unease, attributing it to the increasing remoteness of our location. We were now fully committed to the trail, at least 2 days of hiking in any direction from the nearest access point. The awareness of our isolation lingered at the edges of my thoughts as we prepared for sleep that night. Before entering the tent, I checked that my handguns were easily accessible in my pack, a precaution that suddenly felt less excessive than it had days earlier. By the 5th day, we had settled completely into trail life. Our bodies moved with practiced efficiency, conserving energy on climbs, carefully placing feet on descents. We passed the halfway point of our journey, a milestone we celebrated with the luxury of chocolate bars we'd been saving for the occasion. That afternoon, however, the atmosphere began to shift subtly. The weather remained perfect, clear skies, moderate temperatures, but something else changed. I first noticed it during our midday rest break at a moss-covered rock formation. "Do you feel like we're being observed?" I asked Julia as casually as possible, not wanting to alarm her. She looked up from her trail journal. "What do you mean?" "Probably nothing," I said, scanning the surrounding forest. "Just a weird feeling." But it persisted throughout the afternoon, that crawling sensation between my shoulder blades that signals unseen attention. Several times I stopped abruptly, turning to look behind us, expecting to catch someone or something watching from the trees. Each time revealed nothing but the empty trail and undisturbed forest. "You're jumpy today," Julia commented after my third sudden halt. "Sorry, just thought I heard something." As dusk approached, we located a suitable camping spot roughly 30 yards off the main trail. The area featured a small clearing bordered by thick rhododendron bushes on one side and mature oaks on the other. We prepared camp with practiced efficiency, though I found myself constantly surveying our surroundings. After dinner, sitting beside our small fire, Julia finally addressed my obvious discomfort. "What's been bothering you all day?" she asked directly. "And don't say nothing, I know you better than that." I hesitated, not wanting to infect her with my growing paranoia. "I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone out here." "Like wildlife? Bears?" "No," I replied, struggling to articulate the sensation. "Like human presence, watching us." Julia frowned. "Have you seen anyone?" "No tracks, no sounds that couldn't be explained naturally. Just instinct, I guess." She reached for my hand. "Your instincts are usually good. Want to move camp?" I considered this option but shook my head. Darkness is setting in. Moving now would be more dangerous than staying put. That night I slept fitfully, waking at every sound, real or imagined. Julia's steady breathing beside me provided some comfort, but I couldn't fully surrender to sleep. Each time I drifted off, some noise would jolt me back to alertness. A twig snapping, leaves rustling in patterns that seemed deliberate rather than wind-driven. Dawn brought relief and temporary dismissal of my concerns. In daylight, the forest appeared as it should. Neutral territory, neither friendly nor hostile. We packed quickly and resumed our northward journey, pushing our pace slightly faster than previous days. Throughout that sixth day, the sensation of being monitored intensified rather than diminished. Twice I spotted movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when directly observed. Once, passing through a particularly dense section of trail, I clearly heard footsteps pacing ours from within the tree line, stopping when we stopped, resuming when we continued. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Julia. She nodded, face tightening with the first real concern I'd seen from her. Could be another hiker taking a parallel route? Without calling out or introducing themselves, I questioned. That's not typical trail etiquette. We continued walking, now both hyper-aware of our surroundings. The magical quality of the forest had transformed into something more sinister, each shadow potentially concealing a watcher, each sound carrying ambiguous intent. When we stopped at a stream to refill our water bottles, I noticed something that confirmed my suspicions weren't merely imagination. On the muddy bank, partially obscured by fallen leaves, was a clear boot print. The impression was fresh, the edges still sharp rather than eroded by time or elements. Most tellingly, it pointed in the same direction we were traveling. I motioned Julia over silently and indicated the print. "Someone's following us," she whispered, voice tight with controlled fear. I nodded, and trying to stay hidden while doing so. "Rangers? Maybe checking on hikers?" "Rangers would identify themselves," I replied, "and they'd use the established trail, not parallel it from cover." The remainder of that day took on a surreal quality. We maintained our pace and outward calm, discussing options in hushed tones while scanning constantly for further evidence. By unspoken agreement, we decided to deviate from our planned route, hoping to determine whether the presence would adjust to follow us. It did. An hour after our deliberate detour, I spotted broken branches and disturbed underbrush about 50 yards off our new heading, signs of someone moving hastily through dense forest to maintain their relative position to us. As daylight began fading, we faced a critical decision about where to camp. Standard wisdom suggested staying on or very near the trail, where other hikers might pass. But with no other hikers in sight for nearly 2 days, and the certainty that someone was deliberately tracking us, conventional safety rules seemed inadequate. "We should find somewhere defensible," I suggested to Julia. "Somewhere they can't approach without us knowing." She agreed immediately, her earlier skepticism completely evaporated. We eventually located a small depression near a rocky outcropping that would prevent approach from behind. The position offered good visibility in 3 directions and solid rock at our backs. Not ideal for comfort, but significantly better for security. That night, I placed my guns within immediate reach and suggested we take alternating watch shifts. "You really think that's necessary?" Julia asked, though her tone indicated she already knew the answer. "I hope I'm overreacting," I replied honestly, "but yes, I do." I took the first watch while Julia tried to sleep. The forest at night transforms in ways non-hikers can never fully appreciate. Shadows gain substance, movements become meaningful, and the boundary between imagination and reality blurs. I sat with my back against the rock face, eyes constantly scanning the tree line, ears straining to differentiate normal forest sounds from potential threats. Approximately 2 hours into my vigil, shortly after midnight, I detected a pattern change. The typical nocturnal sounds, insects, occasional owl calls, rustling from small mammals, suddenly diminished. This abrupt hush represented the most alarming signal possible. Something larger was moving nearby, something that disturbed the forest's natural rhythm. I placed my hand on Julia's shoulder, applying gentle pressure to wake her without sound. Her eyes opened immediately, reading the tension in my posture. I placed my finger to my lips and pointed toward the northeastern edge of our clearing. For several minutes we sat motionless, barely breathing, scanning the darkness. The partial moon provided just enough illumination to differentiate shapes, but not details. Then, unmistakably, a shadow separated from the tree line, a human figure moving with deliberate stealth along the perimeter of our camp. Julia's hand found mine and squeezed. I could feel her trembling slightly, but admirably controlled. I reached for the judge revolver with my free hand, keeping the movement minimal and slow. The figure stopped at the edge of our visible range, seemingly assessing our position. Their stillness suggested they hadn't noticed we were awake and watching. After what felt like an eternity but was likely only minutes, they retreated back into the forest shadow. Neither of us spoke until dawn began lightening the eastern sky. We remained vigilant through the remainder of the night, weapons ready, every sense heightened to painful acuity. The figure didn't return, but other sounds periodically emerged from the darkness. Purposeful movement through underbrush, what might have been whispered conversation from multiple sources, once even the distinct sound of metal against metal. "We need to get out of here," Julia whispered as the first genuine sunlight reached our position. "Straight back to civilization, fastest route possible." I agreed without hesitation. We packed quickly, abandoning our planned itinerary entirely. Consulting our maps, I identified the shortest path to the nearest road access point, a 12-mile route requiring a demanding pace through challenging terrain. "If we push hard, we can make it by nightfall," I said, tracing the route with my finger. "No breaks except absolute necessities." "Let's go," Julia replied, already shouldering her pack. As we departed our campsite, I noticed something that hadn't been visible in darkness. A small stone arrangement at the edge of the clearing, 3 rocks stacked in a pyramidal formation. This was no natural occurrence. Someone had deliberately placed them, presumably while we slept before I began my watch. I showed Julia, who stared at the stack with widening eyes. "What does it mean?" she asked. "A marker," I replied grimly. "Either for themselves or others." I kicked the formation apart before we left, though I suspected the gesture was ultimately meaningless. Whoever was tracking us didn't need stone markers to maintain pursuit. We maintained a punishing pace that morning, moving as quickly as safety allowed along the rugged trail. Every few minutes, I would stop briefly, listening for sounds of pursuit. Increasingly, I heard them, branches breaking too deliberately to be wildlife, occasional glimpses of movement parallel to our route. "There's more than one," I whispered to Julia during a brief water break. "They're coordinating, moving in tandem with us." Her face had taken on the taut expression of someone holding fear at bay through sheer determination. "Who are they? What do they want?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But they've had multiple opportunities to approach normally and haven't. That suggests their intentions aren't friendly." By midday, the psychological toll of feeling hunted began affecting our decision-making. The most direct route to the road access point would keep us on the established trail, which was predictable and potentially monitored. Alternatively, we could forge our own path through unmarked forest, more physically demanding, but potentially allowing us to break the pursuit pattern. Off-trail, Julia voted immediately when I presented the options. I'd rather fight through underbrush than keep being stalked like prey. I agreed, and we veered sharply west at the next opportunity, plunging into dense forest where no clear path existed. The going became immediately more difficult. Thick rhododendron thickets tore at our clothing. Hidden depressions threatened twisted ankles, and navigation required constant reference to map and compass. For approximately 2 hours, this gambit appeared successful. The sounds of pursuit faded, and we allowed ourselves cautious optimism that we'd broken contact. Then, crushing that hope, we heard a distinct whistle from somewhere to our north, followed by an answering call from the south. They're flanking us, I realized aloud, working together to maintain visual contact. Julia's face paled. How? How could they possibly know which way we'd go? They know these woods, I replied, the truth becoming increasingly clear. This is their territory, not ours. That revelation shifted something fundamental in our understanding of the situation. We weren't experienced hikers facing an unexpected challenge. We were interlopers being herded by people intimately familiar with this landscape. The psychological advantage had never been ours. By late afternoon, our energy flagging from sustained high-speed travel through difficult terrain, we reached a critical juncture. Our path was blocked by a steep ravine, navigable but time-consuming. Circumventing it would add miles to our journey, likely preventing us from reaching the road before nightfall. We have to go down and up, Julia declared, peering over the edge. We can't spend another night out here. I nodded agreement, though the descent looked treacherous. Nearly 60 degrees in places, with loose soil and few stable handholds. We began carefully using tree roots and exposed rock formations for support, testing each foothold before committing weight. Halfway down, disaster struck. Julia's handhold, a seemingly sturdy root, pulled free from the embankment. She slid several feet, desperately grasping at passing vegetation, before coming to a stop against a boulder. The commotion sent a cascade of soil and small rocks tumbling to the ravine floor. I'm okay, she gasped before I could ask, though her right palm was badly scraped. Just need a minute. That minute proved costly. From above us came the unmistakable sound of multiple people moving quickly through underbrush, drawn by the noise of Julia's fall. They were closing distance rapidly. We need to move, I urged, helping Julia to her feet, right now. We abandoned caution for speed, half climbing, half sliding the remaining distance to the ravine bottom. Above us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure in dark clothing briefly visible at the ravine edge before ducking back from view. The ravine bottom offered momentary concealment via large boulders and fallen trees. We used this cover to assess options. The opposite slope appeared marginally less steep than our descent route, but would still require significant effort that would leave us exposed and vulnerable during the climb. We could follow the ravine instead, Julia suggested, pointing to where the natural channel widened to the east. They'd anticipate that, I countered, and it might lead us further from the road. A sudden sound from above resolved our indecision, the distinct click of metal that my mind instantly recognized as weapon-related. Whether hunting rifle or something else, the implication was clear. Our pursuers were armed and close enough to potentially use those weapons. Up, I whispered urgently. Now! We began ascending the opposite slope, using every available tree trunk and rock outcropping for leverage. The physical demand was immense, burning muscles already taxed by miles of forced-pace hiking. Halfway up, Julia stumbled, a small cry of pain escaping before she could suppress it. Ankle, she managed through gritted teeth. Twisted, not broken. I glanced back toward the ravine bottom. Movement caught my eye. Two figures crossing the space we'd vacated moments earlier. They moved with the confidence of trackers who knew they were closing on their quarry. Without hesitation, I positioned myself beside Julia, offering my shoulder for support. "Lean on me. We go together." The remaining ascent became a blur of pain and determination. Julia's breathing came in controlled gasps as she fought through the injury. My own muscles screamed protest at the double burden. When we finally crested the ridge, we collapsed momentarily behind a fallen tree, gasping for breath. "They're still coming," Julia whispered after a moment, nodding toward the slope we'd just conquered. Sounds of pursuit remained evident, though temporarily more distant. "Road should be less than 2 miles northeast," I replied, consulting our map with trembling hands. "Mostly flat terrain, thankfully." Julia tested her injured ankle, wincing. "I can walk, just not quickly." I retrieved the judge from my pack and checked its load. "I'll take point. You follow at whatever pace works. If we get separated, keep heading northeast. Don't stop, don't wait." She nodded grimly, understanding the implication. If confrontation became inevitable, I would handle it while she continued toward safety. As dusk approached, we pushed forward through increasingly dense forest, every step a calculation between speed and stealth. The sounds of pursuit waxed and waned, but never disappeared entirely. Occasionally, we heard those same whistle communications, signals coordinating our hunters' movements. Darkness arrived before we reached the road. With it came the sobering realization that our navigation had been imperfect. The terrain didn't match our map's indications for where we should be. Either we had veered off course during our desperate flight, or the map itself lacked detail for this particular area. "We need to stop and reorient," I finally admitted, after our third encounter with landmarks that shouldn't have been present. "Stopping feels dangerous," Julia replied, leaning against a tree to relieve pressure on her injured ankle. "Getting lost is more dangerous," I countered. "We could end up moving parallel to the road instead of toward it." We found minimal cover behind a rock formation, and I risked using our flashlight under my jacket to study the map more carefully. After several minutes of triangulating visible landmarks against topographical features, I determined our actual position. "We're further south than I thought," I told Julia. "Road access is more like 3 miles now, not 2. Before she could respond, a flicker of light caught my attention through the trees. Not the steady beam of a flashlight, but the wavering illumination of flame. A campfire, perhaps a 1/4 mile distant. "Other hikers?" Julia whispered hopefully. I shook my head. "Trails nowhere near here, and given recent events." We watched in tense silence as a second light appeared, then a third. The pattern suggested multiple small campfires spread across our eastern approach route, directly between us and the road access we sought. "It's a line," Julia realized aloud. "They're forming a barrier." The implication chilled me more thoroughly than the October night air. Our pursuers weren't merely following. They were actively containing us, establishing a perimeter to prevent our escape. This level of coordination suggested numbers we hadn't anticipated, and a determination that defied rational explanation. "We need to find a gap or go around," I said, trying to maintain tactical thinking despite escalating fear. "They can't have continuous coverage." Julia's face, barely visible in the darkness, showed a combination of exhaustion and resolve. Which direction? I considered our options, factoring in Julia's injury and our dwindling physical resources. "North. Follow the perimeter until we find a breakthrough point." We moved with agonizing slowness, prioritizing silence over speed. Each step required careful placement to avoid the telltale crack of breaking branches. Every few minutes we would pause to listen and observe, tracking the pattern of distant fires to gauge the perimeter's extent. After approximately an hour of this careful movement, we spotted a potential opening, a darkened gap nearly 50 yards wide between two of the flambeaux. Either by design or oversight, this section appeared unmanned. "That's our exit," I whispered, indicating the gap. We advanced cautiously, hyper-aware that appearances could be deceiving. The gap might well contain sentries without fires, their absence of light creating the illusion of safe passage. 20 yards from the perceived perimeter line, disaster struck again. Julia's injured ankle gave way completely on uneven ground, sending her sprawling with a stifled cry of pain. The sound wasn't particularly loud, but in the unnatural stillness of the forest night, it carried. Almost immediately, shouts erupted from multiple locations along the fire line. Flashlight beams cut through darkness, sweeping in widening arcs from our left and right. "They heard us," Julia gasped, struggling to rise. I helped her up, supporting her weight. "Change of plan. No more stealth, we run." "I can't run," she replied, gesturing at her ankle. "Then I'll carry you." What followed tested the absolute limits of human endurance. With Julia on my back, arms around my neck, I pushed forward toward the gap in the perimeter. Each step required tremendous effort, muscles burning with oxygen debt, lungs heaving to supply the necessary air. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, crashing undergrowth, shouted commands, beams of light cutting ever closer. As we approached the perceived gap, a figure suddenly materialized from shadow, a man-shaped silhouette blocking our path. Without breaking stride, I shifted direction, veering sharply right to avoid direct confrontation. "There!" a harsh voice called out. "Heading north!" The shout confirmed our worst fears. We were surrounded by multiple hostiles actively coordinating to intercept us. Our chance of reaching the road undetected had evaporated entirely. I made a split-second decision, one that contradicted all conventional wilderness wisdom. We would abandon any attempt to reach the road and instead head deeper into the forest interior, away from the established perimeter. If we couldn't break through their line, perhaps we could outlast their search efforts by finding sufficiently remote concealment. "Change of direction," I gasped to Julia, turning westward. "We're going back in." "What?" Her voice held understandable confusion. "The road is too well guarded," I interrupted. "We'll find somewhere to hide instead." For the next hour, we pushed deeper into increasingly primitive forest, moving as quickly as my burdened pace allowed. The sounds of pursuit gradually diminished behind us, not disappeared, but attenuated by distance and terrain. When we finally reached the base of a steep ridge, I carefully lowered Julia against a tree trunk. "We need to rest," I admitted, my entire body trembling with exertion. "Just briefly." Julia nodded, her face pale with pain and exhaustion. "Who are these people? Why are they doing this?" I had no answers that wouldn't terrify her further. Instead, I focused on our immediate survival. There should be a natural cave system in this ridge according to the map. If we can locate an entrance, it might provide defensible shelter. After 10 minutes of necessary recovery, we began searching the ridge base for cave openings. The geological composition, predominantly limestone with significant erosion patterns, suggested numerous possibilities. Eventually, Julia spotted what we needed. A narrow fissure partially concealed by vegetation, just wide enough for human passage. I examined the opening carefully, checking for signs of animal habitation or instability. Finding neither, we squeezed through into absolute darkness. I risked using our flashlight briefly to assess the interior. The space opened into a modest chamber approximately 15 feet in diameter, with a ceiling height that allowed us to stand upright. Multiple smaller passages branched from the main chamber, though none appeared to offer better concealment than our current position. "This works," I declared, helping Julia to a relatively flat section of floor. "We can defend this entrance if necessary." While Julia rested, I created minimal barricades near the entrance, loose stones and branches arranged to create noise if disturbed. I positioned myself where I could monitor the opening while maintaining coverage of Julia's position. "Will they find us?" she asked after a long silence. "Eventually," I answered honestly, "but hopefully not before daylight. By then, we'll have recovered enough strength to try again." She nodded, accepting this grim assessment. "Thank you for not leaving me behind." "That was never an option," I replied, reaching for her hand in the darkness. We settled into uneasy vigilance, taking turns staying alert while the other rested. Hours passed with only distant sounds of search activity, occasional shouts, whistles, once even what sounded like hounds baying far to our south. Around what I estimated to be 3 a.m., the search sounds intensified again, closer, more purposeful. They had adjusted their perimeter, narrowing the search grid to include our general vicinity. "They're methodical," I whispered to Julia. "Professional almost." "But who?" she asked again. "Poachers? Drug operations?" "Maybe," I conceded, though neither explanation fully satisfied. The level of coordination and persistence suggested something more organized, more deeply entrenched in these remote forests. As dawn approached, bringing the faintest lightening of the cave entrance, we heard the sound I'd been dreading. Voices directly outside our hiding place, within yards of the concealed opening. "Tracks end here," a gruff voice announced. "Check the brush line." Julia's eyes widened in the dim light, her hand finding mine in silent communication. I positioned myself between her and the entrance, the judge revolver ready. "Got something," another voice called. "Disturbed vegetation. Might be a hole." The sound of boots on stone followed, someone approaching the very fissure we'd used for entry. I raised the weapon, preparing for the confrontation that now seemed inevitable. A beam of light pierced the opening, sweeping across the cave interior. I pressed myself against the wall, momentarily out of its direct path. The light paused, then began a more systematic examination of the space. Just as the beam would have revealed our position, a distant voice called out urgently, "All units, contact at the eastern ridge. Respond immediately." The light beam wavered, then withdrew. Boots scraped on stone as our searcher apparently abandoned the cave investigation to respond to the new development. "Lucky," Julia breathed after several minutes of renewed silence. "Or someone else they're hunting," I replied grimly. "Either way, this is our chance." We waited 15 tense minutes to ensure the searchers had truly departed, before cautiously emerging from our cave shelter. The forest had transformed yet again with approaching dawn. Birds beginning their morning communications, dew glistening on every surface, visibility gradually improving with the lightening sky. Julia tested her ankle and reported improvement, though still far from fully functional. "Which way?" she asked. I oriented myself using the emerging sunlight. "East, directly toward the road. They've apparently shifted focus north, which might give us the opening we need." We moved as quickly as Julia's injury permitted, taking advantage of the transitional lighting conditions, bright enough to navigate efficiently, but still dim enough to provide some concealment. The forest showed increasing signs of human activity: trampled vegetation, occasional boot prints, once even a discarded food wrapper that looked disturbingly recent. After approximately an hour of careful progress, the terrain began sloping downward, and I detected the distant rumble of vehicular traffic, the road we'd been seeking for nearly 24 hours. "We're close," I encouraged Julia, who was pushing through obvious pain with remarkable determination. "I hear it," she confirmed, renewed hope energizing her movements. We crested a small rise, and there it was, a 2-lane asphalt road winding through the valley below us, perhaps half a mile distant. The sight nearly overwhelmed me with emotion. After hours of terror and exhaustion, civilization beckoned with its promise of safety and rationality. "We made it," Julia whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "Almost," I cautioned. "We still need to cross that final distance." The intervening terrain offered both advantages and dangers, primarily open forest with good visibility, but minimal cover if we needed concealment. We would be exposed during our final approach. "Direct route?" Julia asked. I considered briefly, then nodded. "Speed over stealth now. If we're spotted, we make a run for it regardless of consequences." We descended the slope with renewed purpose, eyes constantly scanning for threats while maintaining maximum possible pace. 300 yards from the road, 200, 100. With each step, I allowed myself incrementally more hope that we would emerge from this ordeal intact. At approximately 50 yards from the road's shoulder, a vehicle appeared, an older model pickup truck traveling slowly along our approach route. I pulled Julia behind a large tree trunk, watching cautiously to determine if the truck represented threat or opportunity. "Forest Service?" Julia suggested hopefully. noting the vehicle's dull green color. Before I could respond, the truck stopped directly opposite our position. The driver's door opened and a man emerged, middle-aged, bearded, dressed in camouflage clothing that didn't match any official uniform I recognized. He scanned the forest edge methodically, then reached back into the truck for what appeared to be a radio handset. "They're still maintaining the perimeter," I whispered. "Watching the road." Julia's expression hardened with resolve. "We didn't come this far to be stopped now." "Agreed," I replied, formulating a plan. "When he looks away, we cross at maximum speed further down. Don't stop for anything until we reach the opposite side." We watched intently, waiting for our moment. The man completed his radio communication, then walked to the truck's rear to retrieve something from the bed. As he became temporarily obscured by his vehicle, I signaled Julia. "Now!" We burst from cover, running parallel to the road for approximately 30 yards before cutting directly toward the asphalt. The man shouted behind us. He'd spotted our movement, but we maintained our desperate pace, ignoring everything except the road ahead. Tires squealed as the truck accelerated in pursuit. I pushed Julia ahead of me, turning briefly to confirm the threat. The vehicle was gaining rapidly, the driver's face visible through the windshield, contorted with what appeared to be anger rather than surprise. "Keep going," I shouted to Julia. "Cross and don't stop." As we reached the road's edge, the truck closed to within yards of our position. In that moment of maximum vulnerability, fate intervened in the form of another vehicle approaching from the opposite direction, a silver SUV traveling at normal highway speed. I seized the opportunity, pushing into the road directly in front of the oncoming SUV while waving both arms frantically. The driver hit their brakes, tires skidding on asphalt as they fought to avoid collision. The truck pursuing us immediately slowed, then reversed direction, apparently unwilling to continue the chase with witnesses present. It accelerated away as the SUV came to a complete stop beside us. An elderly couple stared through the windows with expressions of absolute shock, first at our disheveled appearance, then at the retreating truck. "Please," I gasped, supporting Julia, who had collapsed against me. "We need help. People are hunting us in these woods." The elderly couple, Warren and Patricia from North Carolina, proved to be our salvation. They immediately offered assistance, helped us into their vehicle, and transported us to the nearest police station in the town of Cedar Bluff, approximately 20 miles from where they'd found us. The local sheriff's department took our statements with a combination of professional concern and subtle skepticism. We described the pursuit, the coordinated search patterns, the perimeter of fires, and our desperate flight through unfamiliar terrain. Deputies documented Julia's injuries and our general condition, then consulted among themselves while we waited, exhausted beyond measure, in a small interview room. "We've had reports of unusual activity in those areas before," the sheriff finally informed us, returning with coffee and prepackaged sandwiches. "Nothing confirmed, but similar stories from other hikers over the years." "Similar how?" I asked. "People feeling watched. Unexplained camp disturbances. One couple reported items stolen 2 years back." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "But nothing at this scale or intensity." "What about the fires? The coordinated search?" "There were multiple people involved," Julia insisted. The sheriff nodded without committing. "We'll investigate, certainly. Send deputies to the area you've indicated. But those forests cover thousands of acres of extremely remote territory." I understood the subtext. Even with their best efforts, finding evidence of our pursuers would be nearly impossible, especially if, as I suspected, those individuals were intimately familiar with the terrain and accustomed to avoiding official attention. The authorities arranged motel accommodations for us while they processed our report. Julia's ankle received proper medical attention, a moderate sprain requiring several weeks of recovery but no permanent damage. Our physical wounds would heal relatively quickly. The psychological impact would prove more persistent. In the following days, as we recovered enough strength to return home, we learned fragments of local history that might explain our experience. The region had a complex past, former mining communities abandoned when operations ceased, generations of families living off-grid in increasingly isolated enclaves, territorial disputes between various groups claiming ancestral rights to certain forest sections. Some of those hollows haven't welcomed outsiders in decades, a gas station attendant remarked when we mentioned our general hiking route. Folks there keep to themselves and expect others to respect boundaries written on maps or not. Whether our pursuers represented territorial residents, illegal operations requiring privacy, or something else entirely, we would never definitively know. The sheriff's investigation yielded nothing conclusive. A few abandoned campsites, some unusual trail modifications, but nothing directly connecting to our experience. We returned to Richmond fundamentally changed. Our relationship survived but transformed, strengthened in some ways by shared trauma, challenged in others by the lingering effects of sustained fear. Julia continued hiking eventually, though never again in remote areas. I haven't returned to any wilderness trail, my former passion for isolation permanently tainted by memories of those October nights. Sometimes, particularly when autumn leaves begin changing colors, I find myself staring into forest edges with involuntary vigilance, searching for movement that doesn't align with natural patterns. In moments of insufficient sleep or stress, I imagine hearing those coordinating whistles from the darkness beyond our suburban home. The most disturbing aspect remains the purposefulness of our pursuers. They weren't merely territorial residents warning away trespassers. Their methods suggested something more systematic, more practiced. The perimeter of fires, the coordinated search patterns, the radio communications, all indicated a group accustomed to hunting human quarry through difficult terrain. For what purpose, I remain grateful not to know. I tell this story not to discourage wilderness exploration, but to advise caution. Nature itself presents sufficient challenges without adding human malevolence to the equation. Maps define parks and public lands with reassuring clarity, but reality proves messier. Some territories remain effectively claimed despite official designations, and those claims may be enforced by means no regulation anticipates. If you hike the southern Appalachian Trail, particularly those remote sections through Jefferson National Forest, stay on marked paths. Camp only at designated sites where other hikers might pass. And if you sense that crawling sensation between your shoulder blades that signals unseen observation, trust your instincts. Not all who watch from forest shadows welcome your presence, and some boundaries exist only in the understanding of those who have always lived beyond civilization's comfortable reach. As I trudged through the dense, shadowy forest of the Huron-Manistee National Forest in northern Michigan, my flashlight beam piercing the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. The cool October air sent chills down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. I had taken this job as a park ranger to get away from it all. The struggles to pay rent on my tiny Detroit apartment, the daily grind working retail, the loneliness and isolation of city life. I love nature and the outdoors, so when I saw the job posting for a backcountry ranger, I figured it was the perfect escape. Be careful what you wish for, I guess. Now here I was, miles from civilization, responsible for patrolling thousands of acres of remote wilderness alone. During the day it was peaceful, even beautiful, fiery fall colors painting the landscape. But at night, the forest transformed into something more sinister. Maybe it was just my imagination getting the best of me out here in the solitude. The mind can play tricks. But deep down, I sensed something wasn't right. I aimed my light at a noise in the brush, my heart thudding in my chest. Two glowing eyes flashed back at me, and I jumped, but it was just a deer, bounding away into the underbrush. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. "Get it together, Nate," I muttered to myself. "There's nothing out here but the wind and woodland creatures." If only I really believed that. The other rangers at the station, grizzled old-timers who had worked these forests for decades, spoke in hushed tones about strange things that lurked in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods. unnatural things. They warned me to be careful out there, especially alone at night. I had laughed it off at the time. Now I wasn't so sure. The moonlight filtering through the swaying pines cast eerie, shifting shadows across the forest floor as I hiked. An owl hooted mournfully in the distance. Despite my unease, I had a job to do. There was a group of campers who had not returned to the trailhead as scheduled, and I needed to locate them. Hopefully, they had just lost the trail or stayed out a bit too long. In a place like this, it didn't take much for a situation to turn bad. I quickened my pace, moving deeper into the forest. As I stepped into a clearing, an icy dread gripped my chest. The beam of my flashlight fell upon something in the center, a shredded, blood-soaked tent. Torn clothing and smashed equipment were strewn about the abandoned campsite. A sour metallic tang polluted the air. No bodies that I could see, but it was clear something terrible had happened here. With a trembling hand, I unholstered my radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Becker. I've got an abandoned campsite off Trail 14 with signs of a possible animal attack. Requesting backup. Over." Only static and silence greeted me. I tried again. "Dispatch, do you copy? I need assistance." Still nothing but the hiss of empty airwaves. I stared at the useless hunk of plastic. Of course, no signal out here. It was just me, alone in a vast wilderness, with an unknown threat lurking somewhere in the darkness. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, aiming my light toward the sound with my other hand on my sidearm. My flashlight glinted off a pair of feral, inhuman eyes peering out from the underbrush. A growl rumbled from the shadows. Whatever this thing was, it was no ordinary animal. My blood ran cold as the beam caught a glimpse of a looming bipedal silhouette, far larger than any bear. Slowly, I began to back away, not taking my eyes off the shape in the brush. My foot caught on something and I stumbled, glancing down. It was a hiking boot torn off a human foot, the jagged edge of a bone protruding from the gore-soaked leather. When I looked up, the creature was gone, melted back into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared. Only the wind moaned mournfully through the pines. I knew one thing for sure now. The old ranger stories were true. Something was out there stalking the night. And now I had to hunt it down before it claimed more victims. But what chance did one ranger stand against a predator that could tear apart a group of campers without a trace? With a deep sense of dread, I headed into the darkened woods, following the trail of blood. The first fingers of gray dawn light were starting to reach through the trees by the time I arrived back at the ranger station. I burst through the door, startling the other ranger on duty, Fred, an older guy in his 50s with a bushy gray mustache. "Jesus, Nate, you look like hell," he exclaimed, taking in my haggard, bloodshot eyes and dirt-smeared uniform. "What happened out there?" I didn't even know where to start. "I found the missing campers, or at least what was left of them. Something tore them apart, Fred. Ripped their campsite to shreds. I've never seen anything like it." He furrowed his brow. "A bear, maybe, or a pack of wolves. There have been more sightings lately with winter coming on." I shook my head vehemently. This was no bear. I saw it, or at least glimpsed it. It was huge, bipedal. Those campers didn't stand a chance. My voice was trembling as the adrenaline began to ebb away. Fred's face drained of color and he looked away. "You saw it then, the Wendigo." "The what? Wendigo? What the hell is that?" I demanded. He sighed deeply, pouring a cup of coffee from the pot with a shaky hand and pushing it towards me. "It's a native legend around these parts. An evil spirit that was once human before it succumbed to cannibalism. Now it stalks the forest as a malevolent entity, forever hungry for human flesh." I stared at him incredulously. "Fred, you can't be serious. That's just some campfire ghost story." "I wish it was," he said grimly. "But I've been a ranger in these woods going on 30 years now. Seen some things I can't explain. The Wendigo is as real as you and me. And if you saw it, then those campers won't be the last victims." A shudder passed through me as I recalled those inhuman eyes glaring out of the darkness. I had never been a superstitious man, but I couldn't deny what I had seen with my own eyes. Was it possible? Could such a thing really exist? "So what do we do?" I asked hoarsely. Call in a search and rescue? The authorities? Fred shook his head. And tell them what? That a mythical cannibal monster is running amok in the national forest? They'll think we've lost our minds. No, this is a ranger problem. It's on us to handle it like it's always been. But how? I'm just one guy, Fred. I don't know the first thing about hunting a Wendig, whatever the hell it's called. Wendigo, and you won't be alone. He met my gaze, a hardened resolve in his weathered features. I've been tracking this thing for years, just never got close enough. But I know how to fight it, and I'll be damned if I let it keep preying on innocent folk in my forest. He stood and crossed to the gun locker, unlocking it and pulling out a wicked-looking hunting rifle along with boxes of ammo. He started loading rounds into the magazine. Silver bullets, he explained. Only thing that can hurt it, according to the legend. He tossed me a box. Better load up. With trembling fingers, I started loading the silver rounds into my sidearm. I still couldn't quite believe this was happening, that I was about to head into the forest armed for a literal monster hunt. But the grim determination in Fred's bearing told me he believed every word, and after what I had seen, I had to trust the man. Before we head out, there's something else you need to know, Fred said, his voice deadly serious. The Wendigo isn't just a predator, it's a manipulator. It can get into your head, make you see and hear things that aren't there, drive you mad with unimaginable cravings. It did it to the best ranger I ever knew. Who? I asked, dreading the answer. My own damn partner, Fred practically spat. Tim. We were tracking the Wendigo years ago. It lured him away from me somehow, and by the time I found him, he trailed off, his jaw clenching as he fought back emotion. He was too far gone. The thing had already sunk its claws into his mind, warped him into something foul and unnatural. I had no choice but to put him down. A cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I absorbed his words. What kind of abomination were we about to face that could twist a man so thoroughly? I felt the first gnawing pangs of doubt. Was this really a good idea? Charging off half-cocked after a literal nightmare? I was just a guy, a failed college student, not some grizzled monster hunter. But as I met Fred's resolute stare, I knew backing out wasn't an option. There were innocent lives at risk. I thought of those campers, ripped apart and scattered through the underbrush like broken dolls. Whatever this thing was, it had to be stopped. Even if I had doubts about my own abilities, I trusted Fred. The man clearly knew this forest and its dark secrets better than anyone. So, what's the plan? I asked, sounding more confident than I felt as I holstered my gun. The Wendigo is a nocturnal hunter, so it'll have gone to ground now that it's light out, he said. Most likely it'll hole up in the deepest, darkest part of the forest during the day, where only fools and rangers dare to tread. Great, I muttered. And that's where we're going, I presume? Damn straight, he nodded grimly. I've got a good idea of its hunting radius based on the attack sites over the years. I say we use the daylight to track it back to its lair and stake the sucker out. Soon as night falls, we'll end this thing once and for all. Just the two of us against an immortal cannibal spirit, I remarked nervously. I love these odds. Fred cracked a hint of a wry smile. Hell, I've faced worse. Stick close, keep your wits about you, and we'll get through this. Long as we don't let it get in our heads, the Wendigo can bleed like anything else. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of gruff reassurance. But as I shouldered my pack to follow him out into the misty morning forest, I couldn't suppress the sinking feeling that we were heading into something far beyond either of our pay grades. I said a silent prayer that Fred knew what the hell he was doing, because one of us sure as hell needed to. The hunt was on. We hiked for hours through the gloomy forest, following the Wendigo's trail of carnage ever deeper into the wilderness. Fred seemed to know the woods like the back of his hand, picking up signs of the creature's passage I would have overlooked. A splash of blood on a leaf here, a flattened trail of underbrush there. I marveled at his tracking skill even as my sense of unease grew with each step that took us farther from civilization and safety. The towering hardwoods gradually gave way to gnarled, stunted pines and rocky outcroppings, as we ascended into more rugged and forbidding terrain. We didn't speak much, communicating only in terse whispers and hand signals. The only sounds were our own labored breathing, the crunch of pine needles beneath our boots, and the occasional forlorn bird call. It felt as if the very forest was holding its breath, watching and waiting. By mid-afternoon, we reached a ridge overlooking a valley so choked with shadow it looked like dusk had already fallen there. Fred signaled for me to stop and drop, raising his binoculars to survey the terrain below. "There," he whispered finally, pointing toward a wall of solid darkness at the far end of the valley floor. "See that cave? That's where it'll have gone to ground. Didn't get this close to its lair the last time. This is our chance." I peered at the inky blot against the stone, a lightless maw that seemed to swallow the fading afternoon light. An involuntary shiver ran down my spine at the thought of the abomination lurking within. We were really going to do this. Venture into a literal monster's den armed with what suddenly felt like paltry weapons. "Right," I said, trying to steady my jangling nerves. "So what's the plan? We can't just go waltzing in there while it's still daylight out." "We wait," Fred replied calmly, hunkering down into a sheltered spot beneath a wind-twisted tree overlooking the valley. "Soon as dusk hits, that thing will be waking up and ready to hunt, and we'll be waiting for it." I followed his lead, taking cover where I could still see the cave mouth and unslinging my rifle to check it over for the 100th time. The weapon felt clumsy and alien in my city boy hands, but it was all that stood between me and becoming Wendigo Chow. I found myself wishing fervently that I had paid more attention in the firearms training course. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness as we waited for darkness to fall. To keep my galloping fear at bay, I mentally recited every scrap of wilderness survival training I could remember. How to make a fire, how to navigate by the stars, what plants were edible and which meant certain poisonous death. Anything to keep my mind off what was to come. But as the shadows lengthened and the forest began to come alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, there was no escaping the reality of our situation. We were about to go toe-to-toe with a creature straight out of a nightmare, an abomination that broke every natural law. I thought back to my old, mundane life of stocking shelves and scrounging tips and longed for that simplicity. But that was a world away now. Like it or not, my life had become an X-file the moment I set foot in these woods. Just as true night began to settle over the valley like a suffocating blanket, a chilling sound drifted out of the cave. A long, ululating howl that was somehow both animal and terribly human. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Beside me, Fred went tense as a coiled spring. "Get ready," he breathed, bringing his rifle to his shoulder. "The bastard's awake, and it'll be ravenous." I licked my dry lips and tried to quiet my thundering pulse, sighting down my own rifle with arms that trembled with mingled fear and adrenaline. This was it. No more waiting. In mere moments, we'd be facing down an impossible monstrosity in a fight for our lives. At the mouth of the cave, a shifting patch of deeper darkness separated from the shadows. A looming silhouette, vaguely man-shaped, but far too tall and gangling to be human. Embers of red fire glowed in the place of its eyes. The Wendigo threw its head back and issued another unearthly howl, a sound of endless hunger and pure predatory bloodlust. Then it started loping towards us up the hill, moving far faster than anything that size should, eating up the distance at a terrifying rate. "Light it up," Fred roared. The crack of his rifle split the night. I pulled my trigger and felt the kick of the stock against my shoulder. I saw the muzzle flash, saw the Wendigo stagger but not fall. It recovered with blinding speed and came at us again, its momentum barely checked. Fred and I fired again, the shots booming in the enclosed valley. The Wendigo jerked and snarled as the silver rounds found their marks in its gaunt, ashen flesh. Black blood splattered the leaves, but still it kept coming, closing the distance with horrifying implacability. 20 yards. 10. My pulse hammered in my ears. The Wendigo's huge, clawed hands flexed, its lipless mouth in a permanent skull's grin. I could smell the charnel reek rolling off it. I fired until my gun clicked empty, barely aware of my own screaming. The Wendigo was nearly on top of us. I fumbled for another ammo clip with numb fingers, knowing I'd never reload in time. This was it. This was how I died, torn apart by a folkloric nightmare. "Get down!" Fred bellowed. I caught a glimpse of him holding something that looked like a bundle of road flares taped to a block of putty. With a mighty heave, he lobbed it into the Wendigo's path, the monster's blazing eyes fixed on the improvised explosive sailing towards it. In the heartbeat before impact, I swear I saw something like confusion cross its distorted features, as if it couldn't comprehend the audacity of its prey fighting back. Then the bundle struck the Wendigo square in the chest and detonated in a blinding flash of chemical fire. The concussion hammered the air from my lungs and sent me tumbling backwards. Through tear-stung eyes, I saw the creature rear back, engulfed in searing white phosphorus flames. Its agonized shrieks pierced the night, a sound I knew would revisit my nightmares for years to come. "Burn, you son of a bitch!" Fred shouted over the roar of the flames, scrambling to reload. I followed his lead, jamming a fresh clip into my gun with hands that shook with uncontrollable adrenaline tremors. Together we poured round after round into the writhing conflagration that had been the Wendigo. Each shot struck home in showers of sparks and ichor. Just when I dared to hope we had the upper hand, a taloned arm shot out of the blaze with terrifying speed, closing around Fred's throat. He choked out a strangled cry as he was lifted off his feet. The Wendigo emerged from the dying flames like a vision of hell, its flesh charred and sloughing but still terribly animate. Impossibly, horribly, it still clung to cursed life, despite the grievous wounds crisscrossing its gaunt frame. "Fire!" Fred gasped out through his constricted airway, scrabbling at the claw crushing his windpipe. "Only way." In a flash of desperate insight, I understood. I ripped open my pack, fumbling for the emergency road flare. I ignited it with trembling fingers, and with a hoarse shout, charged at the Wendigo, brandishing the fizzing red torch before me like a holy relic. The creature shrieked and fell back, dropping Fred to the leaf litter. It cringed before the flare's furious light, shielding its malformed face. I pressed the attack, thrusting the sputtering flame at it again and again, driving it back towards the ridge. The Wendigo teetered at the edge of the rocky drop. For a single, crystallized second, our eyes met, man and monster, predator and prey. In that eternal instant, I saw behind its burning gaze to the twisted, damned soul within, a monstrous hunger that could never be sated. Then I lunged forward with a final cry and buried the flare into the center of its chest. The Wendigo threw its head back and loosed an ear-splitting screech. The chemical fire spread over its body in a flash, consuming it with unnatural swiftness. It pinwheeled its burning arms and toppled backwards off the ridge, trailing flames and echoing wails. I collapsed to my knees, my strength leaving me all at once as I watched the creature plummet. It struck the jagged rocks at the base of the cliff and burst apart like a sack of burning ashes. By the time the scattered embers winked out, there was nothing left. No body, no trace of the abomination that had stalked these woods for untold years. Only a scattering of gray dust already blowing away on the night wind. I felt a hand clap weakly onto my shoulder. I turned to see Fred, battered and bloodied but alive, his eyes glinting with fierce, proud light. "You did good, kid," he rasped out through a bruised throat. "Real good. Bastards never coming back from that." I nodded, unable to summon any words. The full weight of all that transpired crashed over me. I felt tears I didn't know I was shedding tracking through the ash on my face. My body shook with release of terrors faced and survived. We sat there together, two broken men in the desolated woods, watching the stars wheel uncaring overhead for an endless minute. The impossible ordeal we had just endured already felt more like a shared fever dream than reality. But we were alive. Damaged perhaps beyond what any amount of mandatory counseling could heal, but alive. And the Wendigo's years-long reign of slaughter and terror was finally, conclusively over. In that moment, it was enough. It had to be. Fred broke the silence first. "Come on, let's get the hell out of here," before anything else shows up looking for a snack." He held out a hand to pull me to my feet. I stood, slinging my rifle and shouldering my much lightened pack. The hike back out to civilization would be a long one, and there'd be no escaping the fallout when we reported in. Missing campers, bodies, impossible creatures in the night. This would be one for the record books. But looking over at Fred's lined face in the moonlight, I knew I wouldn't have to face it alone. We were brothers now, forged in the crucible of horror. Nothing could change that. And so, with wary eyes and weapons ready, we set out once more into the haunted dark of the forest, leaving the ashes of nightmares behind, for now, knowing that true evil is never so easily killed. The Wendigo was gone, but there would always be other hungry shadows waiting in the pines, other monsters to hunt. Now, more than ever, I understood the heavy mantle I had taken on by choosing this life. But I walked forward anyway, into the unknowable reaches of the night, no longer the green city boy who had first trembled before these woods. I was a ranger now, tempered and true, and I had promises to keep before I slept. The night swallowed us quickly and the long hunt went on. The trek back to the ranger station was a blur of exhaustion and residual terror. Each snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had me whirling around, half expecting to see those malevolent red eyes glaring out of the darkness once more. But the Wendigo did not reappear. It seemed the creature had truly met a fiery end on the jagged rocks. Fred and I stumbled into the station just before dawn, looking like we'd gone 10 rounds with a wood chipper. The other rangers gaped at our haggard, bloodied appearance. "What in God's name happened to you two?" the station chief demanded, hurrying over with a first aid kit. Fred and I exchanged a long look, a silent agreement passing between us. How could we even begin to explain the impossible horror we had faced out there in the darkened woods? Who would believe such a fantastical tale? "Animal attack," Fred said finally, his voice a ragged croak. "Big grizzly, came out of nowhere. We got lucky." The lie tasted sour on my tongue, but I nodded along. Better they think us mauled by a bear than raving about cannibalistic spirit monsters. We submitted to a barrage of medical attention and endless debriefing, sticking to our flimsy cover story. Over the next few days, search and rescue teams scoured the woods for the missing campers. They found only the sad remnants of the Wendigo's past victims scattered through the underbrush. Of the creature itself, there was no sign, to my profound relief. But even as the furor died down and life at the station returned to an uneasy normalcy, I couldn't shake the feeling that some fundamental shift had occurred, like a veil had been ripped away, exposing the true terrifying nature of the world. I jumped at shadows and could scarcely sleep without nightmares of glowing red eyes and grasping claws jolting me awake in a cold sweat. And yet, alongside the fear, I felt a new sense of purpose kindling inside me. Fred and I had faced the impossible and triumphed. We had stood against a true nightmare and saved untold lives in the process. Could I really go back to my old, oblivious existence after that? I found myself at Fred's cabin a week after the incident, 2 chipped mugs of steaming coffee sitting untouched between us as I poured out my churning thoughts. "Tell it to me straight," I said finally, meeting his faded blue eyes. "Are there more things like the Wendigo out there? More monsters?" Fred sighed heavily, his gaze as haunted as I felt. "More than you can imagine, kid," he replied softly. "The Wendigo was just the tip of one very nasty iceberg." I exhaled shakily, my worst fears confirmed. "Then how can you stand it?" I asked, "knowing what's really out there in the dark?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because someone has to," he said at last. "Someone has to stand watch and protect the unsuspecting from all the hungry horrors most folk are lucky enough to never see." I swallowed hard, already knowing my answer. There could be no going back to blissful ignorance, not anymore. Not for me. "Then, I want in," I said, my voice hardening with resolve. "Teach me what you know. How to hunt these things down and make sure they never hurt anyone again." A slow, approving smile crept over Fred's grizzled face. He reached across the table and clasped my shoulder. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. And despite the enormity of the burden I had just shouldered, I felt a spark of fierce, bright purpose kindling to life within me. I was a ranger, and I had a sacred duty to uphold no matter how high the cost. The next weeks passed in a flurry of intensive training under Fred's gruff tutelage. He taught me everything he knew about the hidden world of monsters lurking in the shadowed corners of reality. How to track signs of their presence, what weaknesses to exploit, which eldritch texts held scraps of useful lore. Some nights we'd pore over ancient, crumbling tomes and obscure websites, piecing together knowledge that most would consider the ravings of madmen. Other times Fred would run me through grueling field exercises, honing my mind and body into a weapon against the paranormal. Despite the seriousness of our mission, I found a strange kind of peace in the focus and purpose of my new calling. The shadows of the world held far fewer terrors when you devoted yourself to dragging them into the light. But that hard-won equilibrium was shattered the night the nightmares began. I bolted awake in a tangle of sweat-soaked sheets, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a disoriented moment, I couldn't remember where I was, still half-trapped in the vivid images that had torn me from sleep. Jumbled flashes of blood and shadow, inhuman figures stalking through mist-shrouded pines, the echoing screams of unseen victims, and at the center of it all, a shape I recognized with a thrill of instinctive dread. The looming, emaciated figure of the Wendigo, blazing hate in its red eyes. But that was impossible. The Wendigo was dead, blasted to cinders before my eyes. This had to be just my overactive subconscious, the stress of recent events taking its toll. As my hammering heartbeat slowed, I noticed a faint, acrid scent hanging in the air. Familiar, but out of place. With a sudden chill, I placed it. The stench of charred flesh and burnt fur. I was reaching for my phone to call Fred, not caring about the late hour, when a soft, muffled rustling from downstairs froze me in place. The hairs on my nape prickled. There was something in my house. Silently, I retrieved my rifle from the bedside gun safe, slipping in a clip of silver ammo with an unpleasant sense of déjà vu. Thus armed, I crept down the darkened hall to the top of the stairs. Below, I heard it again, the soft scrape of something moving furtively through the shadows. My finger tightened on the trigger. I descended the steps cautiously, fighting down the panicked urge to charge in, guns blazing. My eyes strained against the gloom, probing for any hint of movement. The rustling came again from the kitchen. The bitter tang of burnt meat grew stronger. Sweat beaded my brow despite the chill. I swung around the corner, rifle up and ready. "Come out now, nice and slow," I ordered, my voice far steadier than I felt. A shape detached from the darkness, taking a shuffling step into a shaft of moonlight. Despite the training, despite all I had seen, the sight still seized my heart in a fist of utter horror. It had once been a man. Most of his lower jaw was missing, torn away by something with very sharp teeth. Char-edged holes gaped in his ragged clothing where bits of flesh appeared to have been bitten off. One eye was a pulped, oozing ruin. But worst of all was the jerky, unnatural gait of his movements, the spasmodic twitch of his remaining facial muscles. He moved like a marionette dancing to unseen strings. The ruined mouth gaped, a gargling parody of speech bubbling up from the ravaged throat. "Oh, hun, Gree." I backed away, rifle trembling in my white-knuckled grip. The thing that had been a man matched me step for step, its shredded lips peeling back in a ghastly rictus grin. My back hit the wall. With nowhere else to go, I squeezed the trigger in a single sharp report. The silver round took the shambling horror in the chest, punching a fist-sized hole clean through. It staggered drunkenly and kept coming, oblivious to the wound. "No," I breathed, the futile denial of a mind confronted by the impossible. "No, no, no." I fired again and again, each shot finding its mark, but to no avail. The macabre puppet jerked and lurched under the impacts, yet advanced still, skeletal fingers grasping. With a final, strangled cry, I lunged to the side in a frantic bid to escape. But the abomination was faster than its broken shell suggested. A rotting hand clamped around my ankle, dragging me to the floor in an explosion of pain. I lashed out desperately as the thing crawled up my body, its reeking, eyeless face looming over mine. I could see squirming movement in the glistening ruins of its empty eye socket. Impossibly strong fingers closed around my throat, inexorably tightening. I gagged and fought, but the thing's grip was as unyielding as a corpse's rigor mortis. As my vision narrowed to a tunnel of impending blackness, I heard that awful voice rasp into my ear, dank breath gusting over my face. "Hungry, Ranger, and you're next," I screamed, and sat bolt upright in bed, my cry still ringing off the walls. No monstrous cadaver, no unnatural struggle in the dark, just my sweat-damp sheets and racing heart. A dream. It had all been a horrifically vivid dream. Relief crashed through me in a dizzying wave, but as I reached for the bedside lamp with a badly trembling hand, I froze, ice crystallizing in my veins. There, clearly visible against the rumpled white sheets, was a single, unmistakable smear of ash-gray powder. Wendigo dust. I called Fred immediately, not caring that it was the middle of the night. To his credit, he answered on the first ring, his voice alert and free of sleep. I poured out the whole twisted tale in a shaking rush, from the nightmarish visions to the ghastly animated corpse that had attacked me. There was a heavy silence on the line when I finished. I could practically hear the grim wheels turning in Fred's head. "It's not over," he said finally, his tone leaden with dread. "We hurt the Wendigo. Maybe even destroyed its physical form, but we didn't kill it. Not fully." An icy fist clenched in my gut. "What do you mean? How is that possible?" "I've heard tell of this before," Fred replied. "In the oldest stories. They say the Wendigo is more than just a monster. It's a spirit of insatiable hunger, an elemental force of greed and gluttony. Blasting its body apart only scattered it. Then, the thing in my house, the dust." I swallowed hard against rising gorge as the grim picture took shape. The Wendigo was still out there, its essence reforming, animating corpses to do its bidding. And if the dream visions could be believed, I was to be its next target. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice sounding very small and very scared to my own ears. "We finish this," Fred said grimly. "Once and for all. Meet me at the station. We're going to need supplies for this one." The line clicked off. I stared at the phone in my hand, the tightness in my chest a mix of terror and resolve. The Wendigo had made this personal now, violating the sanctity of my mind, my home. It was time to return the favor. An hour later, I pulled up to the ranger station to find Fred waiting, his battered truck loaded down with ominous cargo, ropes, chains, bags of rock salt, and bundles of dried sage. Grim determination etched the lines of his weathered face. "You said it's coming for me next," I said by way of greeting, shouldering my rifle. The phantom sensation of grasping undead fingers around my throat hadn't fully faded. "That's our opening," Fred nodded. He tossed me a coil of climbing rope. "And I've got a plan to exploit it." As we rumbled off into the misty pre-dawn woods, he laid out the details. It was a desperate, dangerous gambit, but it was the only play we had. I was going to let the Wendigo take me, offer myself up as bait to lure the creature into a final confrontation on our terms. Fred would be my hidden ace in the hole, waiting to spring our trap. The key was an ancient Algonquin banishment ritual, the only way to expel the Wendigo's spirit once and for all before it could fully reconstitute itself. But for the ritual to work, we needed to have the creature in its most vulnerable state, the in-between moment as its essence prepared to take physical form. And for that to happen, it needed a host. Me. "I don't like this," Fred grumbled, as he triple-checked the bindings securing me to a tree deep in the monster's former hunting grounds. "Too many ways it could go sideways." "You got a better idea? I'm all ears," I shot back, my nerves jangling. Being served up like a happy meal for a cannibalistic forest demon wasn't exactly my idea of a pleasant woodland stroll either. Fred just grunted, tightening the last knot. "Remember, keep your mind clear, your will strong," he said. "The Wendigo will try to worm its way into your head, make you lose control. You've got to hold on to who you are." I nodded shakily, throat dry with anticipation and dread. Fred pulled a hood over my head, plunging me into darkness. The plan depended on the Wendigo being drawn to my scent first, my identity hidden until it was too late. Alone with my hammering pulse, I reached for that core of hard-forged resolve, wrapping it around myself like armor against the horrors to come. The crunch of Fred's footsteps receded, leaving me in eerie silence broken only by the hiss of my own breathing and the forlorn creak of swaying branches. I flexed against the ropes to reassure myself I could break free when the critical moment came. Then I settled in to wait for the nightmare to find me. Time stretched into an endless purgatory of uncertainty and gathering dread. My world narrowed to the sound of my own heartbeat drumming in my ears, each rustle of leaves sending tense lightning down my spine. The air turned sharp and cold, searing my lungs. That bitter, charred stench crept into my nostrils once more. It was here. I held myself perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The ropes creaked as a presence circled the tree, considering. A low, grating rasp issued from the darkness, words that resonated in my bones rather than my ears. Foolish, arrogant creature. A brutal yank and my hood was ripped away. I blinked against the sudden shock of wan moonlight, still blind after so long in the dark. It crouched before me, a grotesque patchwork of decaying flesh stretched over misshapen bone, a monstrous Frankenstein's jigsaw of the Wendigo's victims. Rents in the necrotic skin revealed an awful, pulsing red glow beneath, a furnace heat of insatiable hunger. Those malevolent crimson eyes fixed on mine with cruel intelligence, seeing through to the fear I couldn't quite hide. The lipless jaws parted in a death's head grin, grave dirt and old blood crusting its teeth. "You cannot stop this," it hissed, skeletal fingers caressing my face in obscene imitation of a lover's touch. "I am eternal." I wrenched aside, revulsion rising like bile in my throat. The Wendigo laughed, a sound like snapping bones and screams. Then its hand closed over my face in a vice, oily decay stench flooding my senses. I felt the dark energy roiling off the thing in waves, a bottomless void of need and craving. The first trickles of corruption seeped into my mind, seeking cracks in my psyche. Hellish visions of slaughter and consumption flashed behind my eyes, the Wendigo's countless victims screaming out for mercy, for release. It wanted me to feel their suffering, break me open until there was room for nothing else. No. With a ferocious act of will, I slammed my mental walls into place, blocking the poisonous influence. I wouldn't let it in. I knew who I was, Nate Becker, park ranger, monster hunter, and I had a job to do. "You're the only one getting stopped, you son of a bitch," I growled through gritted teeth. Then I heaved with all my strength against the bindings. The ropes snapped like rotten twine in a shower of splintered bark. I dove forward, taking the startled Wendigo down in a tangle of thrashing limbs. We rolled across the forest floor in a ferocious grapple, a frantic race to pin the other first. I used every dirty close-quarters combat trick Fred had drilled into me. But the Wendigo's patchwork body was damnably fast and strong, matching me blow for blow. Claws raked my chest and arms, repaid by hammering elbow strikes to the monstrous head. For a moment I thought I had it. My forearm jammed under its chin in a choke. Then the Wendigo's jaws yawned open far wider than should have been possible and closed on my arm in a spray of blood. I screamed as ancient teeth shredded meat and bit down to bone. With a heave, the Wendigo flipped me over and slammed me to the ground. The impact knocked the air from my lungs in an agonized rush. Blackness swam at the edges of my vision as the creature reared up over me. This was it. Our desperate gambit had failed. I had only seconds before the Wendigo claimed its final prize. Then the night erupted in blinding actinic blue-white light. A bolt of searing electricity arced over me to strike the Wendigo square in its chest. The monster went rigid, animate flesh, sizzling and popping. The stink of cooked meat stung my nostrils. "Chew on this, you bastard!" came Fred's welcome bellow. He stood braced at the edge of the clearing, a neon-crackling taser the size of a cinder block clutched in his hands, twin wires leading from its muzzle to the electrocuted Wendigo. I rolled clear, taking grim satisfaction in the creature's agonized spasms as Fred poured on the juice. No way was that Taser standard Ranger kit, but I made a mental note to requisition a dozen just like it if I survived the night. Fred finally cut the current and I moved in, silver chains in hand. We bound the twitching, burned husk to a nearby oak as it mewled pathetically. To an onlooker, it would have almost seemed cruel, if not for what we knew lurked within. "Hold it steady," Fred commanded. With a grunt of effort, he heaved a bulging rucksack off his shoulder and upended it over the Wendigo. A cataract of salt poured out, burying the monster in a crystalline mound. Fred uncapped a plastic jug and began pouring a circle of pungent liquid around the shuddering pile. The stinging scent of gasoline cut through the char and rot. "Here's the wind-up," he muttered, striking a flare. "And the pitch." I finished the old baseball saying in a whisper as Fred tossed the sputtering phosphorus into the ring of fuel. Whoosh! The clearing erupted in blistering heat and eye-searing light. Twin gouts of flame raced along the gasoline trail to crash together at the Wendigo's pyre, igniting the ancient dry wood and salted corpse into a shrieking bonfire. The monster struggled against its chains, engulfed by the blaze. Its body blackened and cracked, spilling more of that awful red glow out into the raging inferno. A terrible, rising wail split the night, laced with fury and agony. Fred seized me by the shoulder, lips moving in a fierce chant I couldn't understand. Some First Nations invocation dredged up from archive and memory. As if in answer, the hungry flames billowed higher, ravening tongues lashing at the darkness. At the heart of the blaze, straining against its bonds, the Wendigo's skeletal maw stretched wide in a final defiant howl. Then the creature burst apart in an eruption of searing white light and rushing wind. I staggered back, throwing up a blistered arm to shield my eyes. An unearthly, agonized keening filled the air, a psychic wail of loss and unimaginable frustration. The blazing glow surged skywards in a twisting coil, fighting the pull of Fred's chant. For a moment it writhed overhead like a tormented serpent, before finally dispersing into a spray of embers and fading echoes on the wind. The fire collapsed in on itself with a muffled whoomp. Silence crashed down, broken only by the crackle of settling wood and my own labored breathing. It was over. The Wendigo was gone. Not just dispersed or diminished, but erased. The Algonquin ritual had worked, expelling the hateful spirit to whatever hell had first spawned it. Fred kept chanting a moment longer, eyes squeezed shut in fierce concentration. Only when the last cinders winked out did he allow himself to fall silent, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. I sank to my knees, the adrenaline rush abandoning me all at once. Every cut and bruise, every fractured bone and torn muscle shrieked for attention. But it was a good pain, a cleansing pain, proof of survival, of victory. Fred limped over to join me. For a long moment, we simply sat side by side amidst the smoking ruin, two battered soldiers after a battle not needing to speak. Finally, I cleared my throat. "Hell of a fireworks show," I croaked, voice sandpaper raw. A wry, almost smile tugged at the corner of Fred's mouth. "Damn right. Couldn't have done it without you, Nate. The Wendigo might have got a few pieces of us, but we got all of it, thanks to you." He clasped my uninjured shoulder, a gesture of both comfort and comradeship. I returned it fiercely, blinking back sudden tears. The next words came hard but sure, a promise to the night and the one who'd guided me through its darkest hour. "I'm in this fight, Fred, for the long haul, no matter what else is out there. I'm with you to take it down, to the end." He nodded once, solemn as a blood oath. To the end. As we limped out of that blasted clearing, battered but unbeaten, I felt the weight of those words settle over me, heavy as a yoke, but also a badge of prideful purpose. Fred and I had won the night, closed a chapter of horror older than memory. But it was just one battle in a longer, darker war. I was a ranger, and evil's watch had only just begun. Autumn came on hard the year after the Wendigo. Biting winds and sheeting rain stripped the trees to skeletal claws grasping at a gunmetal sky. But even as nature took on a deathly pallor, New life kindled in the hidden corners of the forest. In hushed whispers, hikers and hunters spoke of glimpsing the impossible between the pines. Towering figures that loped on two legs, dark shapes rising from mist-shrouded lakes on membranous wings, eerie lights bobbing in the trackless deep woods. Sightings reported on paranormal blogs and subreddits, cross-posted with frantic debates about hoaxes and campfire tales. But Fred and I knew better. We watched the signs and the seasons, tracked patterns in roadkill and missing person reports. As September bled into October, we took up our well-worn beats, rangers as much hunting the monsters as protecting their potential quarry. On the surface, little had changed. The Wendigos' rampage hadn't left enough evidence to prompt more than a morbid curiosity in the official investigation, quickly consigned to the cold case files. The campers' remains were laid to tragic misadventure. The grisly animal attacks to the inevitable press of predators as winter loomed. But those who knew the forest well noted the changes. That Ranger Becker, no longer the fresh-faced fish out of water, but a cagey old hand, tight-lipped and thousand-yard stare. How he and Fred always took the worst shifts, the riskiest patrols, yet unerringly found their way back as dawn limned the tree line. The other rangers didn't pry. The woods held their secrets, and they were wise enough not to want to know what stalked the dark places, what manner of unquiet terrors my brother-in-arms and I kept at bay by dint of blood and bitter knowledge. I still took some solace in the rhythms and duties of normal ranger life. There was no better balm for the soul than selfless service, whether guiding a lost hiker to safety or teaching some tow-headed scouts how to read a compass. For a while I could almost forget what I'd become, what hunted me as surely as I hunted it. But the nightmares never stopped. Crimson eyes in the night, flashes of mutilated flesh, alien hungers crawling beneath my skin. The Wendigo's final curse, its obscene echo, never forgotten, never faded. Some nights I'd jerk awake, gripping my scarred arm as phantom teeth sank into the bone, muffling screams so as not to wake my neighbors. After, I'd stagger into the bathroom and stare into my pallid reflection, wondering what looked back, the man or the monster. It was the price of survival, Fred said. The cost of the knowledge we carried, the burden we'd taken on. I took a cold comfort in that, in his gruff companionship. My brother in the secret war, fighting for our tiny corner of the world, one horrific skirmish at a time. Our patrols ranged farther, our nets spread wider, caches secreted in hollow logs and ranger blinds, salt, silver, rare herbs, and ancient charms. An arsenal against the night, assembled piece by blood-bought piece. Sometimes we arrived to a scene too late, finding only gory tableaus of ruin and unanswerable questions. We burned the bodies, scattered the ashes, swore to do better, and we stalked the dark trails anew, grim and resolute. As All Hallows' Eve approached, the veil between worlds grew thin. Restless shades prowled the midnight forest. Will-o-wisps danced in the hollows. Webbed footprints in the creek mud hinted at things that should not be. Through it all, Fred and I kept our solemn vigil, unsung guardians on the frontier of nightmare. We'd learned to find a fierce, defiant joy in the fight, in the promise of a dawn unbroken by horror, bought with our sweat and blood. But deep in my marrow, I knew this was only the beginning, that what we did mattered, but the scales would never balance. The forces we faced were primordial, as old as fear itself. For every evil vanquished, two more would rise from the shadows to take its place. And yet, we'd go on. One hunt, one fight, one flickering light raised against the hungry darkness at a time. Because we were rangers, and we had promises to keep before we slept. I walked the night trails alone, a silver blade in hand and a prayer on my lips, waiting for the next set of red eyes in the dark, the next chapter in a story that would never truly end, only begin anew. I was ready. My name is Aaron Whitaker, and back in 2017, I took a solo RV trip through the remote parts of the Gila National Forest in New Mexico. Just to get away, you know? I'd been through a brutal breakup and I was craving a little peace and quiet. I thought some quiet time out there might actually do me some good. Plus, I always liked a bit of adventure, and nothing sounded better than miles of solitude where no one knew my business. It was late afternoon when I finally parked the RV by a rocky clearing near the edge of a small river. The place was gorgeous, quiet, not a soul in sight, just me, the trees, and a slow-moving stream. I set up camp, got my fold-out chair out, cracked a beer, and sat down, breathing in that fresh mountain air. Just peace and stillness. Perfect. By the time I'd finished my second drink, I noticed the wind picked up, blowing harder than it had before, making the trees sway in that deep rustling way that always makes you feel just a bit on edge. I brushed it off as a little trick my mind was playing on me. Guess even out here in the woods, my thoughts could still drift back to some of the uglier parts of life. A couple of hours passed. The light started to fade, so I gathered some wood to start a fire. I didn't realize until then just how dark it got out there, with the mountains blocking the horizon. As I lit the fire, a stray thought crossed my mind about how isolated I really was. Out there, it'd take anyone an hour to reach me if anything went wrong. It's funny, that was what I'd come for. But now the thought made me feel uneasy. The forest sounds changed as night fell. I tried convincing myself it was natural, but everything seemed amplified. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, stones occasionally skittering down the nearby slope. I stared into the flames, watching them dance and trying to shake the growing sensation of being watched. My phone had no service here. I'd told my brother where I was headed, approximately, but even he didn't expect to hear from me for at least 3 days. 3 days of complete isolation. The thought that had seemed so liberating that morning now felt suffocating. I pulled out my notebook, thinking I'd jot down some thoughts, maybe even sketch the landscape as a distraction. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote. The words looked foreign on the page, like someone else had written them. Something feels wrong here. After warming up by the fire for a while, I heard a soft crunching from somewhere behind me, just out of sight. Probably just some animal curious about the light and the smell of the food, I thought. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The footsteps weren't the quick, light steps you'd expect from a rabbit or a fox. They were slower, almost deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight, aiming it in the direction of the sound. The beam caught a shape, tall, looming, definitely not a coyote or anything small. My heart thumped as I made out the silhouette of a man, just standing there, half hidden by the trees about 30 feet away. I called out, asking who was there, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, just stayed in the shadows, watching. Now, I've got nothing against people, but I sure wasn't looking for company that night. I stood up and asked him again if he needed help or was lost, but he didn't budge. I could barely make out his features in the dim light, but something about him just didn't sit right with me. His stance was too rigid, too unnatural. "All right, I think it's time for you to head out," I said, mustering as much authority as I could. To my surprise, he took a step forward, revealing his face. Wild, disheveled hair, and a look in his eyes that made my skin crawl. He just grinned at me, a wide, chilling grin that seemed more like a snarl than a smile. I could feel my pulse quicken as he moved even closer, his hands clenching and unclenching like he was sizing me up. There wasn't a single friendly bone in this guy. I backed up slowly, trying not to look away, my mind racing for options. The RV was a few yards away, but I didn't want to turn my back on him. I thought of the knife in the kitchen drawer, a flimsy thing, but better than nothing. As if sensing my thoughts, the guy suddenly lunged forward, his grin vanishing, replaced with a dead-eyed focus. I bolted, sprinting for the RV. I slammed the door shut, locking it just as he threw himself against it, pounding with such force that the whole vehicle shook. My hands shook as I fumbled for the knife, all the while hearing his fists battering against the door. He didn't yell, didn't curse, just this relentless, violent pounding, like he was possessed by something that didn't tire or feel pain. After a few agonizing moments, the pounding stopped. I held my breath, gripping the knife tight, listening. Silence. My pulse pounded in my ears. I tried to peer through the small window, but all I could see was darkness. I knew he was still out there. I could feel it. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I lost track of time, just sitting there, clutching the knife and waiting for any sound. Then I heard the soft scrape of metal against metal, the sound of a lock being toyed with. My heart nearly stopped. I locked the door, hadn't I? How could he? I rushed to the door and found it slightly ajar. Somehow he'd managed to crack it open just enough. I shoved it shut, but as I did, something caught my eye, a makeshift tool, probably crafted from a piece of metal or wire, wedged into the lock. He'd picked the lock. My blood ran cold. Just as I was bracing myself to push the door shut, a face appeared in the window. His face, inches away, his grin wider and more twisted than before, as if he was savoring every moment of my fear. He tapped the window with a crooked finger, then pressed his face against it, his mouth moving silently, mouthing words I couldn't make out. The tapping continued, rhythmic, taunting. I backed away slowly, moving further into the RV, realizing that I had only two options: wait him out or make a run for it. But where would I go? Outside was nothing but pitch-black wilderness, and if he could pick the lock, he'd get in eventually. The interior light flickered, once, twice, then went out completely. I froze, listening to the sound of his breathing against the window. My fingers traced along the wall until I found the emergency flashlight I kept mounted by the bed. When I clicked it on, the beam caught something that made my stomach drop. Muddy handprints smeared across the inside of the skylight above me. How long had he been in here before I arrived? What had he touched? What had he left? I made a decision. I was done sitting there like a scared rabbit. I grabbed a heavy wrench from under the sink, clenched it in my hand, and forced myself to step toward the door. If he was getting in, he'd have to go through me. As I neared the door, I heard a low chuckle from outside, followed by a whispered taunt. "You think you're safe in there?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in years, almost feral. Something snapped in me then. Anger replaced the fear, and I flung the door open, wrench raised, ready to swing. But he wasn't there. I looked around, breathing hard, the night swallowing up every sound. Just when I thought maybe he'd finally left, I heard his footsteps circling the RV, slow and deliberate, like he was toying with me. Then a loud crash. I spun around to see that he'd smashed the back window with a rock, shattering glass everywhere. I didn't wait for him to get inside. I bolted out the front door into the night, wrench still in my hand. I didn't have a plan, but I knew staying inside was a death sentence. I sprinted into the trees, branches scratching at my face, feet pounding the earth as I pushed deeper into the forest, trying to lose him in the maze of trees. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the brush, laughing, that awful guttural laugh that echoed through the forest. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they were going to give out. I found a thick cluster of trees and crouched down, trying to slow my breathing, trying to make myself invisible. The footsteps got closer, slower now, like he knew I was nearby. He was talking to himself, muttering words I couldn't make out, but it was clear he was enjoying this. I don't know how long I crouched there, but eventually his footsteps faded. I stayed there, still and silent, waiting to make sure he was gone. Finally, when I couldn't hear anything but the wind and my own heartbeat, I crept back toward the RV, hoping he'd left it. The RV was trashed. The back window was shattered, glass covering the floor, and the door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I could see my things scattered, as if he'd been rifling through them. But he was gone. Just gone. I didn't stick around to question it. I threw whatever I could salvage back into the RV and got the hell out of there, driving down that winding forest road faster than I probably should have, not stopping until I was miles from that place. The headlights cut through the darkness, but every shadow along the road looked like him. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely keep the wheel steady. I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I would see him standing in the middle of the road behind me, or worse, somehow clinging to the back of the RV. Around a sharp bend, my headlights caught something that made me slam on the brakes. A tree had fallen across the narrow road. The RV skidded to a stop just inches from the massive trunk. My first instinct was to back up, find another route. But then a terrible thought crossed my mind. What if he had done this? What if this was a trap? I sat there, engine idling, scanning the tree line on either side of the road. The forest seemed to press in closer, the shadows deeper and more threatening than before. I couldn't go forward, and I was terrified to go back. I was trapped. I grabbed the wrench again and stepped outside, keeping the engine running and the lights on. The fallen tree was massive, too big to move alone. As I approached it, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The cut at the base was fresh, a clean slice from a saw. This wasn't a natural fall. Someone had cut it deliberately. The sound of a twig snapping somewhere in the darkness sent me scrambling back to the RV. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and threw the vehicle into reverse. I'd find another way out, no matter how long it took. The narrow road made turning around impossible. So I began slowly backing up, constantly checking my mirrors. The road twisted and curved, making the reverse journey painfully slow. Each bend obscured my view of what lay behind, and more than once I had to stop and get out to check my path. During one such stop, I heard it, whistling. A tuneless, eerie sound that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He was still out there, still hunting me. I made it back to the main junction and frantically consulted my map. There was another route, longer but wider, that would take me out of the forest. I turned onto it, praying it wasn't blocked as well. As I drove, the whistling faded, but the sense of being followed didn't. Every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of something in my mirror, a shadow moving between trees, the flash of what might have been headlights far behind me, gone when I looked again. Dawn was breaking when I finally reached the ranger station at the edge of the park. I pulled in, horn blaring, desperate for another human presence. The ranger who came out looked startled, then concerned as I stumbled from the RV, still clutching the wrench, clothes torn, face scratched from branches. Later, when I was safely out of those mountains, I did some digging. Found out that he was a drifter who'd been spotted in the area a few times. People said he lived up there, hiding out, getting by on whatever he could steal from campers and hikers. He'd been arrested a few times, always let go due to lack of evidence. But there were stories about him, stories that made my blood run cold. He'd attacked people before, had some sort of twisted thrill for it. The local sheriff's deputy took my statement with a detached professionalism that bordered on dismissive. "Probably just a vagrant," he said, flipping through his notepad. "We get reports like this from time to time. Folks get spooked in the woods, especially when they're camping alone." "This wasn't just getting spooked," I insisted, pointing to the shattered window of my RV, the scattered belongings. "He tried to get in. He followed me." The deputy nodded, but I could tell he'd already filed me away as another tourist who couldn't handle the isolation. "We'll keep an eye out," he assured me. "But these drifters, they move around a lot, hard to track." I wasn't satisfied with that response, so I headed to the local library to do some research of my own. The librarian, an older woman with kind eyes and a wary expression, perked up when I mentioned my encounter. "Where exactly were you camping?" she asked, voice lowered, though we were alone in the reference section. I showed her on the map, and she nodded slowly. "That area has a history," she said, pulling out a collection of local newspaper archives. "People go missing up there sometimes. Not often enough to raise alarms, but regular enough that locals know to avoid it." She helped me sift through years of local papers, reports of hikers gone missing, campers who'd fled in the night with stories of being stalked, ransacked campsites. Most were attributed to wildlife, psychiatric episodes, or exaggerated fears, but the pattern was unmistakable. "There's a name some of the old-timers use," she said, hesitating. "They call him the Watcher. Been stories about him since I was a girl. My grandmother used to say he was once a normal man, a hunter who got lost in those mountains during a blizzard, survived by doing terrible things, came back changed. I thanked her for her help, though I wasn't sure what to make of the folklore angle. The man I'd encountered wasn't some supernatural entity. He was flesh and blood, dangerous and disturbed, but human nonetheless. Back at the motel, I spread out everything I'd learned across the bed. News clippings, printed forum posts from hikers who'd had strange encounters, a list of missing persons reports from the area over the past 20 years. 17 people who'd vanished without a trace, most dismissed as accidents, victims of the harsh terrain or wild animals. I called the numbers of a few people who'd reported encounters similar to mine. Most didn't want to talk, but one woman, Rebecca, agreed to meet me at a diner just outside of town. I thought I was crazy, she said, clutching her coffee mug with trembling hands. No one believed me. Said I was just nervous about camping alone as a woman. But I know what I saw. Her story matched mine in unsettling ways. The watching, the circling, the taunting. But she'd escaped before he'd made his move, driving away in the middle of the night. The rangers found my campsite completely destroyed the next day, she said, like someone had torn through it in a rage. Looking for me, I guess. As we talked, I noticed a man sitting alone in a booth across the diner, watching us intently. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away, but not before I caught something familiar in his gaze, a calculating coldness that set my nerves on edge. We should go, I said to Rebecca, dropping cash on the table. Now. Outside, I explained what I'd seen. We hurried to our cars, and as I watched her drive away, I caught sight of the man again, standing at the diner window, staring directly at me. It wasn't him, not the man from the forest, but there was something in his stance, his attention, that felt connected. That night, someone tried to break into my motel room. I woke to the sound of the doorknob rattling, saw the shadow of feet under the door. I called out, and the movement stopped. Then, whispered through the crack, "You should have stayed away from here." I left town the next morning, but I couldn't leave it behind. The experience stayed with me, lurking at the edges of my consciousness like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. I'd catch myself checking locks twice, 3 times before bed. I'd wake in the night convinced I'd heard tapping at my window. Every unfamiliar face on the street became a potential threat, every unexpected sound a warning. Months passed. I sold the RV, couldn't stand to look at it anymore, much less sleep in it. I moved to a new apartment in a busy neighborhood, surrounded by people and noise and light. I should have felt safer, but instead, I felt exposed, visible. The research folder stayed with me, growing thicker as I continued to dig into the history of the Gila wilderness and its secrets. I connected with more survivors online, people who'd had encounters they couldn't explain, who'd sensed that predatory presence watching them from the trees. We formed a loose network, sharing information, comparing notes. A pattern emerged. The attacks seemed to cluster around certain phases of the moon, certain times of year, as if he was following some internal calendar that only made sense to him. Then the emails started coming. Anonymous messages with no text, just coordinates. Locations in the forest where hikers had gone missing, where destroyed camps had been found. Someone was feeding me information, leading me deeper into the mystery. The final email contained a single image, a crude map drawn on what looked like a piece of bark, marking a location deep in the forest. Below it, scratched in what might have been blood, home. I knew I should take everything to the authorities, but my previous experience with the local sheriff left me doubtful they'd act. And something else held me back. A growing suspicion that whatever was happening in those mountains was known, tolerated, perhaps even protected by some in the community. Against all logic and self-preservation, I found myself driving back toward the Gila National Forest 6 months after my encounter. This time, I was prepared. Proper hiking gear, a satellite phone, a hunting knife, and most importantly, I wasn't alone. 2 others from our online group had agreed to join me. Marcus, a former Army Ranger whose brother had disappeared in the area 3 years earlier, and Tina, a wildlife photographer who'd captured something in the background of one of her shots that she couldn't explain. we established a base camp at a ranger-monitored site, giving us a safe place to return to each night. By day, we explored the areas marked on our collective maps, documenting everything, interviewing locals who'd spent their lives in the shadow of the mountains. On our third day, an elderly man approached us at a local diner. "You're looking for him," he said, not a question, but a statement. "Been watching you ask around." He claimed to be a former search and rescue volunteer who'd spent decades in the mountains. "There are places up there," he told us, voice low, "where the forest feels wrong, where animals won't go, where the air sits heavy, like something's watching, waiting." He marked a location on our map, his gnarled finger tracing a route up to a remote ridge. "There's a cave system there. We found things inside, evidence of someone living there. But the sheriff ordered us to leave it alone, said it was outside our jurisdiction." That night, as we prepared to check the location, Marcus received a call from the motel manager. Someone had broken into his room, left a warning scrawled on the bathroom mirror. "The forest keeps its secrets." We should have left then, reported everything and let professionals handle it. But we'd come too far, invested too much. The next morning, we headed into the wilderness, following the old man's directions. The hike was grueling, the terrain growing steadily more difficult as we ascended. Around midday, we noticed something odd. The forest had gone silent. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just our labored breathing and the crunch of our boots on fallen leaves. The cave entrance was partially hidden behind a stand of dense pines, unremarkable except for the unnatural arrangement of stones around its mouth. Too deliberate to be coincidence, too irregular to be man-made in any conventional sense. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of decay. Our flashlights revealed a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber, and there, in the flickering light, we found evidence of habitation. A crude sleeping area, stacks of items clearly stolen from campers and hikers over the years, walls covered in disturbing symbols and tallies. But it was the far wall that stole my breath. Photographs, dozens of them, pinned to the rock. Images of people in the forest, unaware they were being watched. Sleeping in tents, sitting by campfires, hiking on trails. And among them, to my horror, was a photo of me, from that night 6 months ago, sitting by my fire, looking peaceful and unaware. We were so focused on the discovery that we didn't hear the footsteps until it was almost too late. A shadow fell across the cave entrance, blocking the natural light. We turned, flashlights raising in unison to illuminate the silhouette standing there. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's, and that same terrible grin spread across his face as he recognized me. "You came back," he said, his voice a rasp that echoed through the chamber. "They always come back." Behind him, more shadows moved, more figures emerging from the trees. Not one man, but many, a whole community of watchers living in these remote mountains, hunting together, sharing their spoils. As they advanced, I reached for the satellite phone, desperate to call for help. But I already knew the truth that had eluded me all these months. In these mountains, no one was coming to save us. Whatever happened next, we were entirely on our own. And as I faced the grinning drifter and his silent companions, I understood at last why the forest had gone so quiet. The predators were no longer hiding among the trees. They were standing right in front of us. It was early June 2023 when I first encountered true terror. Summer had barely begun to stretch its warm fingers across the landscape, and I was 16, naive and eager for adventure. My best friend since elementary school, Theo, had convinced me to spend a week at Pine Ridge Summer Camp, a place nestled deep in the Adirondack Mountains. "It'll be awesome, trust me," he'd insisted, waving the brochure in my face. "We'll swim, hike, maybe meet some girls." The typical teenage motivations that seemed so important back then. My parents dropped us off that Sunday morning, the gravel crunching beneath our car tires as we pulled into the sprawling campground. Pine Ridge looked exactly like those summer camps you see in movies. Wooden cabins arranged in neat clusters, a large central lodge with a stone chimney, trails leading off into dense forest, and a glittering lake visible through the trees. Parents milled about, helping unload duffel bags and sleeping bags, hugging reluctant teenagers goodbye. "You sure you want to do this?" my mom asked as she handed me my backpack. "A whole week is a long time." "I'll be fine," I assured her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Truth be told, I'd never been away from home for more than 2 nights, but I wasn't about to admit that in front of Theo, who was already chatting with some other campers nearby. The camp director, a broad-shouldered woman named Miss Winters, gathered everyone around the flagpole for orientation. She had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and spoke with an authoritative tone that immediately commanded respect. "Welcome to Pine Ridge," she announced. "Parents, please make sure you've signed all the consent and medical forms before you leave. Campers, once you're registered, you'll be assigned to cabins with your respective counselors." Registration was a tedious process of forms and name tags, but eventually, Theo and I were assigned to Cabin 7, along with 8 other boys around our age. Our counselor's name was Vincent, and this is where my memory first prickles with unease. Vincent wasn't what I expected in a camp counselor. While the others were energetic, outdoorsy types in their early 20s, Vincent was different. He was tall and unnervingly thin, with pale skin that suggested he avoided sunlight whenever possible. His hair was black, long, and perpetually looked unwashed, hanging limply around a gaunt face dominated by deep-set eyes. When he smiled, which was rare, it never reached those eyes. "Welcome to Cabin 7, he said, his voice oddly soft as we entered the rustic wooden structure that would be our home for the next week. "Choose any bunk except the one by the door. That's mine." Theo immediately claimed a top bunk near the back window, and I took the one below him. The other boys, whose names I would soon learn were Ryan, Jake, Will, Cody, Ben, Gabe, Jason, and Troy, scattered to their chosen beds. Vincent watched us silently from the doorway, his thin arms crossed over his chest. There was something about the way he observed us, clinical, detached, that made my skin crawl. But I dismissed my discomfort as first-day nerves and the natural awkwardness of being in a new place. That night, after we'd unpacked and had dinner in the main lodge, Vincent gathered us around a small fire pit behind our cabin. "Camp tradition," he explained, his face ghostly in the firelight. "First night, we share something about ourselves that no one else knows. Something secret." The other boys shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Vincent smiled that empty smile and added, "I'll start. Before I worked here, I spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility for observation." The silence that followed was deafening. I remember looking at Theo, whose eyes had widened to the size of quarters. Was this some sort of joke? But Vincent's expression remained completely serious. "They said I had unusual thought patterns," he continued, staring into the flames. "But they couldn't diagnose me with anything specific, so they let me go." His eyes lifted, scanning our faces one by one. "Your turn." I don't remember what secrets were shared that night. My mind was too preoccupied with Vincent's revelation and the growing certainty that something wasn't right about him. What kind of camp hired someone with a psychiatric history to supervise minors? Why would he share something so personal on our first night? As I lay in my bunk later, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest and the rhythmic breathing of 9 other people, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake coming here. Outside, an owl hooted mournfully, and somewhere in the distance, something crashed through the underbrush. But neither of those sounds disturbed me as much as the soft, almost imperceptible footsteps of Vincent, pacing back and forth by the cabin door until long after midnight. Monday morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the distant sound of a bugle signaling breakfast. For a moment, I forgot about Vincent's strange behavior the previous night, caught up in the excitement of my first full day at camp. Theo was already up, pulling on a t-shirt and shorts. "Dude, get up," he said, throwing a pillow at my head. "I heard they're doing pancakes today." The main lodge was buzzing with activity, campers lining up for food, counselors directing traffic and answering questions, kitchen staff hustling behind the serving counter. I spotted Vincent sitting alone at the far end of a table, methodically cutting his pancakes into identical squares before eating each one individually. He didn't look up when we entered. After breakfast, Miss Winters announced the day's activities: canoeing, archery, rock climbing, and swimming. We would rotate through them in our cabin groups. "I'm signing up for swimming first," Theo declared, heading toward the activity board. I followed, scanning the crowd for familiar faces from our cabin. That's when I first noticed her. A girl with auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail, laughing with a group of friends. As if sensing my gaze, she looked up, and for a brief moment, our eyes met before I awkwardly looked away. "Her name's Ivy," a voice said quietly beside me, causing me to jump. Vincent had appeared at my elbow without making a sound. "She's in cabin 3, second year here." His eyes remained fixed on her for several uncomfortable seconds before he turned to me. "You should focus on activities, not girls. There's not enough time for both." His tone was neutral, but something in his expression, a tightness around his mouth perhaps, suggested disapproval. Before I could respond, he moved away to gather the rest of our cabin. Our first activity was canoeing. The lake was calm that morning, its surface a mirror reflecting the surrounding pines and the cloudless blue sky. Vincent paired us up and assigned canoes, but opted to stay on shore himself. "I'll watch from here," he said, settling onto a rock with a clipboard. "Someone needs to make sure none of you drown." Theo and I paddled out to the middle of the lake, far enough that Vincent became a small, dark figure on the shoreline. "So what's the deal with our counselor?" Theo asked, dipping his paddle lazily in the water. "That story last night about the psych ward, pretty weird, right?" "Definitely weird," I agreed, glancing back toward shore. Even from a distance, I could feel Vincent's eyes on us. He gives off strange vibes. "Maybe he's just socially awkward," Theo suggested with a shrug. "Some of these outdoor types aren't great with people." I wanted to believe that explanation, but something told me there was more to Vincent than simple awkwardness. The way he moved so silently, how he watched people when he thought no one was looking, the calculated precision of his actions. It all seemed deliberate, rehearsed, as if he were playing a role he hadn't quite mastered. The rest of the morning passed without incident. Vincent remained distant but functional, giving instructions and keeping time. At lunch, I managed to position myself at a table where I could see Ivy, gathering my courage to talk to her. But as soon as I stood up with my tray, Vincent materialized beside me. "Time for archery," he said flatly. "Let's go." At the archery range, Vincent transformed. What had been detachment became intense focus as he demonstrated proper technique. His hands moved with surprising grace as he nocked an arrow, drew back the bowstring, and released. The arrow hit the center of the target with a solid thunk. "The key is to become one with the arrow," he told us, his voice taking on an animated quality I hadn't heard before. "Visualize its path. Feel the tension in the string as an extension of your own muscles." He moved among us, correcting our stances and grips. When he reached me, his cold fingers adjusted my elbow, lingering a moment too long. "You need to relax," he murmured, standing close enough that I could smell something medicinal on his breath. "Your fear is visible in your posture." I wanted to ask what he meant by that. I wasn't afraid of archery. But something in his expression stopped me. His eyes held a knowing look, as if he could see straight through me to some truth I wasn't aware of myself. Later that afternoon, during free time, Theo and I explored the camp boundaries, discovering a small clearing with fallen logs arranged in a rough circle. "Perfect hideout," Theo declared, flopping down on one of the logs. "We should come back here at night, maybe bring some of the others." I was about to agree when I noticed something carved into the log beside me, a series of crude stick figures with exaggerated limbs. They appeared to be running from a larger, more angular figure. The carving was fresh, the exposed wood still light against the weathered surface. "Hey, check this out," I called to Theo, running my finger over the etching. "Probably some kids from last year," he said without much interest. or maybe one of the younger cabins this year. But something about the carving disturbed me. The fleeing figures conveyed such panic, such desperation in their simple lines. And the pursuing figure, there was something familiar about its elongated form. As we headed back toward camp for dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Twice I turned suddenly, thinking I'd catch someone following us, but the trail behind us remained empty. Yet the sensation persisted. Eyes tracking our movements through the dense undergrowth, monitoring, assessing. "Did you hear that?" I asked Theo after a particularly loud rustle in the bushes. "Probably just a squirrel," he said, though he quickened his pace slightly. "This place has you jumpy." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the isolation of the camp, combined with Vincent's oddness, was making me paranoid. But as we emerged from the tree line into the clearing where the cabin stood, I glanced back one last time and saw a shadow move between the trunks, too tall and too deliberate to be any kind of animal. That night, I lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the sounds of the cabin. 9 different breathing patterns, some deep and regular, others punctuated by soft snores or mumbling, but I counted only 9. The 10th, Vincent's, was missing. His bunk by the door lay empty, the covers neatly arranged as if they hadn't been disturbed. I don't know what prompted me to look toward the window, but when I did, I nearly cried out. Vincent stood outside, his tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight, staring directly at our cabin. He remained motionless for what seemed like hours, a sentinel watching over, or perhaps watching, his sleeping charges. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my unease, and I drifted into uneasy dreams filled with stick figures running through endless forests, pursued by a shadow that never tired. Tuesday brought clouds and a chill that hadn't been present the day before. The mountains surrounding Pine Ridge seemed closer somehow, more imposing under the gray sky. A light mist hung over the lake, giving the entire camp an isolated, otherworldly feeling. Vincent was already up when we awoke, sitting on his bunk fully dressed, writing in a small black notebook. He snapped it shut as soon as the first boy stirred. "Morning hike today," he announced without preamble. "Dress warmly." At breakfast, I noticed dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept at all. His movements were slightly more jerky than usual, his gaze more intense as it swept across the dining hall. When he caught me watching him, his lips twitched in what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Sleep well?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Had he seen me watching him through the window last night? Had he been there specifically so I would see him? The questions churned in my stomach, spoiling my appetite for the eggs and bacon on my plate. The morning hike took us along a narrow trail that wound up into the hills behind the camp. Vincent set a brisk pace at the front of our group, occasionally stopping to point out a plant or rock formation in a monotone voice that suggested he was reciting from a script rather than sharing genuine interest. "Red trillium," he said, crouching beside a 3-petaled flower, also known as wake robin or stinking Benjamin. Native Americans used it as a birthing aid. He looked up at us, his expression blank. "It's also highly toxic if ingested improperly. Just 1 gram of the rhizome can cause vomiting, diarrhea, and potentially death." The casual way he mentioned death sent a shiver through me. Throughout the hike, Vincent seemed to focus exclusively on the dangerous or poisonous aspects of nature, which mushrooms could stop your heart, which plants could cause painful blisters, which innocent-looking berries could paralyze your respiratory system. "Dude's like a walking death encyclopedia," Ryan whispered to me as Vincent lectured about the various ways the eastern timber rattlesnake could kill a person. "It's weird," I agreed. "Like he's trying to freak us out. Or giving us ideas," Ryan added with a nervous laugh that died quickly when Vincent's head swiveled in our direction, his eyes narrowing slightly. The trail eventually led to an overlook with a view of the entire camp below. The cluster of cabins, the main lodge, the lake now partially obscured by mist. Vincent instructed us to take a break, drink water, and appreciate the perspective. As the others chatted and rested, I wandered a few yards away, seeking a better vantage point. The ground dropped off sharply beyond some rocks, creating a small cliff face that wasn't visible from the main trail. As I peered over the edge, something caught my eye, a small cave or crevice in the rock face below, and something moved inside it, something pale. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, when a hand clamped down on my shoulder with surprising strength. I nearly lost my balance, my heart leaping into my throat. "Dangerous," Vincent said, pulling me back from the edge. His fingers dug into my shoulder painfully. "One slip, and we'd be scraping what's left of you off those rocks." He kept his hand in place as he leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the cliff face below. When he straightened up, his expression had changed, hardened somehow. "Stay with the group," he said flatly. "No wandering." For the remainder of the hike, Vincent positioned himself behind me, allowing the other boys to lead the way back to camp. I could feel his presence like a physical weight, his eyes boring into my back. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was there, watching with that same flat expression. Back at camp, we had an hour before lunch. Most of the boys headed to the lake to skip stones, but I needed some space from Vincent's oppressive presence. I told Theo I wanted to rest in the cabin, but instead, I made my way to the camp office, a small building attached to the main lodge. Miss Winters was inside, reviewing paperwork. She looked up with mild surprise when I entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, setting down her pen. I hadn't planned what to say. How could I articulate my vague suspicions without sounding paranoid? Vincent hadn't actually done anything explicitly wrong or threatening. His behavior was odd, unsettling, but was it reportable? "I was just wondering," I began hesitantly, "about our counselor, Vincent." Miss Winters' expression shifted slightly, a brief tightening around the eyes that vanished so quickly I might have imagined it. "What about him? How long has he worked here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "This is his second summer," she replied, her tone measured. "He came highly recommended from Lakeside Camp in Vermont." "Oh, that wasn't what I expected. And he's qualified? For working with teenagers, I mean?" Miss Winters folded her hands on the desk, studying me with new interest. "Vincent passed all the necessary background checks and certifications, if that's what you're asking. Is there a specific concern you'd like to share?" I hesitated. Put into words, my feelings about Vincent seemed childish, based more on instinct than evidence. "He just seems intense, different from the other counselors." "Different doesn't mean unqualified," Miss Winters said, her tone softening slightly. "Vincent has his own approach to mentoring, but he's excellent at maintaining safety and order. Some of our most positive feedback last year came from his cabin." I nodded, not entirely reassured, but unsure how to press further without revealing the extent of my discomfort. As I turned to leave, Miss Winters called after me. "If there's ever a specific incident that concerns you, my door is always open," she said. The emphasis on specific was subtle but clear. Vague unease wasn't enough to warrant action. As I exited the office, I nearly collided with a figure standing just outside the door. Vincent, his arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. "Just checking the activity schedule for tomorrow," I lied, heart hammering in my chest. Had he heard my conversation with Miss Winters? "Interesting," he said, drawing out the word. "Since the schedule is posted on the board by the dining hall, not in the office." Before I could formulate a response, the lunch bell rang, saving me from having to explain further. Vincent gestured toward the dining hall with an exaggerated sweep of his arm. "After you," he said, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Wouldn't want you to miss lunch. You'll need your strength for this afternoon's activities." Something in the way he emphasized strength made my stomach clench. As I walked ahead of him toward the dining hall, I could feel his eyes on me, calculating, assessing. Whatever suspicions I had about Vincent, I was now certain of one thing. He had similar suspicions about me. And in this isolated environment, far from home and under his authority, That realization terrified me more than any strange behavior he had exhibited thus far. Wednesday afternoon brought brief respite from Vincent's constant presence. After lunch, the cabin groups were split up for specialized activities based on individual preferences. I had signed up for nature photography, hoping it would give me some time alone to clear my head and process everything that had happened. Theo chose rock climbing instead, leaving me on my own for the first time since we'd arrived at Pine Ridge. The photography group was small, just 6 of us plus a counselor named Ben, a cheerful guy with sun-bleached hair and the perpetual tan of someone who lived outdoors. His easy manner and genuine enthusiasm were a stark contrast to Vincent's clinical detachment, making the difference all the more obvious. Ben led us to a trail that followed a small river feeding into the lake. "The light here is perfect this time of day," he explained, adjusting settings on his own camera. "And there's tons of wildlife if you're patient." We spread out along the riverbank, each seeking our own subjects to photograph. I wandered farther downstream, relieved to be away from constant supervision and the growing tension in Cabin 7. The sound of running water soothed my frayed nerves, and for the first time in days, I felt myself relaxing. I was crouching to photograph a cluster of wildflowers when I heard someone approach from behind. Turning, I expected to see Ben checking on my progress. Instead, I found Ivy, the auburn-haired girl from the dining hall, camera in hand. "Sorry," she said, offering an apologetic smile. "Didn't mean to startle you. Ben said we could spread out as long as we stayed within sight of the river." "No problem," I replied, surprised at how steady my voice sounded despite the sudden acceleration of my heartbeat. Up close, I could see that her eyes were hazel, flecked with gold in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. "I've seen you around," she continued, stepping closer to examine the flowers I'd been photographing. "You're in Cabin 7, right? With Vincent?" Something in her tone when she said Vincent's name caught my attention, a slight hesitation perhaps, or a subtle change in pitch. "Yeah," I confirmed, watching her expression carefully. "Do you know him?" Ivy straightened, her gaze shifting to the river. "Not really. He was here last summer too, but he mostly kept to himself." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Some of the girls thought he was intense." "That's one way to put it," I said, grateful for the opportunity to discuss Vincent with someone who might share my concerns. "He's definitely different from the other counselors." Ivy nodded, absent-mindedly tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "There was an incident last year," she said, her voice lowering slightly, even though no one else was within earshot. "Nothing official or anything, but this girl in my cabin, Amber, said she woke up one night and saw him standing at the window of our cabin just watching." The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I remembered Vincent's silhouette outside our cabin window. "Did she report it?" "To who? Miss Winters? She thinks Vincent walks on water. Besides, what would she say?" "I think I saw a counselor outside at night. It's not exactly criminal." Ivy sighed, then forced a smile. "Anyway, I'm probably being dramatic. Camp breeds ghost stories, right?" I wanted to tell her about everything I'd observed, Vincent's night wanderings, his fixation on death and danger, the cave in the cliff face, his reaction when I visited the office. But something held me back. Saying it aloud would make it real, would transform my nebulous unease into concrete accusations. And if Vincent had already noticed my suspicions, drawing Ivy into it might put her at risk as well. Instead, I suggested we move farther downstream, where the river widened into a small pool edged with smooth stones, a perfect spot for photography. As we walked, the conversation shifted to lighter topics: our schools, our hobbies, our reasons for coming to Pine Ridge. Ivy was from a town about 2 hours away and had been coming to the camp since she was 12. Photography was a recent interest, sparked by a class she'd taken in school. For a while, I forgot about Vincent and the tension of the past few days. We took photos, compared techniques, and eventually settled on a large, flat rock by the water's edge to review our shots. The afternoon sun warmed the stone beneath us, and the gentle sound of the river created a peaceful backdrop. In that moment, Pine Ridge felt like the summer paradise it was meant to be, rather than the setting for growing dread. "This one's amazing," Ivy said, showing me a photo she'd taken of a water strider skimming across the surface of the pool, its shadow perfectly reflected below. I leaned closer to see her camera's display screen, suddenly aware of how near she was. The scent of her shampoo, something citrusy, mingling with the earthy smell of the forest. When I looked up from the camera, our faces were inches apart. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then I saw it, a figure standing motionless among the trees on the opposite bank. Even at this distance, I recognized the lanky silhouette, the distinctive posture. Vincent. I jerked back, adrenaline flooding my system. Ivy followed my gaze, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm when she spotted him. "Has he been there the whole time?" she whispered, instinctively moving closer to me. "I don't know," I admitted, unable to look away from Vincent's still form. I didn't see him before. Vincent made no attempt to move or call out, despite the fact that he was clearly visible to us. He simply stood there, partially obscured by a pine tree, watching. "We should go back," Ivy said, quickly gathering her camera. "Ben will be looking for us." I nodded, suddenly very aware of how far we'd wandered from the main group. As we hurriedly collected our things, I raised a hand in Vincent's direction, a reluctant acknowledgement of his presence. He didn't respond, didn't wave back, didn't move a muscle, just continued staring with that same flat intensity that had become so unsettlingly familiar. We retreated upstream, walking faster than necessary, checking over our shoulders every few yards. By the time we rejoined the photography group, my hands were shaking so badly I had to put my camera away. "You two went pretty far," Ben remarked when we returned, his tone casual but his eyes questioning. "Just following the good light," Ivy replied with forced nonchalance. "Did you get any good shots of the heron?" Ben launched into an enthusiastic description of the bird he'd photographed, and the moment passed. But as the group headed back toward camp, I noticed Ivy scanning the trees around us, her earlier ease replaced by vigilant tension. I found myself doing the same, expecting to glimpse Vincent's pale face watching from behind every trunk and boulder. Back at camp, as we approached the central clearing, Ivy pulled me aside briefly. "Be careful," she murmured, her eyes serious. "Vincent, there's something not right about him." I didn't want to say too much before, but Amber wasn't the only one who had weird experiences last year. Before I could ask for details, we were interrupted by the arrival of other campers streaming toward the dining hall for dinner. Ivy squeezed my arm once, then disappeared into the crowd, leaving me with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that my instincts about Vincent weren't mere paranoia. At dinner, I searched for Vincent among the counselors' table but didn't see him. Theo slid onto the bench beside me, his face flushed with excitement from rock climbing. "Dude, you missed it," he enthused, piling mashed potatoes onto his plate. "I made it all the way to the top of the advanced wall. Even Joey said it was impressive, and he never compliments anyone." I nodded absently, only half listening as I continued scanning the dining hall. "Hello, Earth to Space Cadet," Theo said, waving a hand in front of my face. "What's with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," I said quietly. "Vincent. He was watching me and Ivy by the river today, just standing there staring. It was extremely disturbing." Theo's expression sobered. "Okay, that is weird. But maybe he was just checking on you, making sure you were safe. From across the river, without saying anything?" I shook my head. "No way. There's something seriously off about him, Theo. Ivy said there were incidents last year, too." "What kind of incidents?" I started to explain what Ivy had told me, but movement near the entrance caught my eye. Vincent had entered the dining hall and was scanning the tables, his gaze methodical and searching. When his eyes landed on me, he paused, then changed direction, heading straight for our table. "He's coming over," I whispered urgently to Theo. "Don't mention any of this." Vincent slid onto the bench across from us, his tray holding a precisely arranged meal, foods separated into distinct sections, not touching. "Productive afternoon?" he asked, his eyes fixed on me with uncomfortable intensity. "Yeah, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Photography was great. I saw you by the river, he said, cutting a piece of chicken into a perfect square, with the girl from cabin 3. The way he said it, flat, emotionless, made it sound like an accusation rather than an observation. Ivy, I supplied, refusing to be intimidated despite the rapid beating of my heart. She's in the photography group too. Vincent nodded slowly, placing the precisely cut piece of chicken in his mouth and chewing with deliberate care before speaking again. You went quite far downstream, he noted, beyond the designated activity area. Ben said it was fine as long as we stayed near the river, I countered, remembering Ivy's words. Ben isn't your assigned counselor, Vincent replied, his voice taking on a slight edge. I am, and I'm responsible for your safety. We were perfectly safe, I insisted, growing increasingly uncomfortable under his unblinking stare. Were you? Vincent's lips curved into what might have been a smile on anyone else, but on him looked more like a grimace. The river gets treacherous beyond that bend. The current is stronger than it looks. People have drowned there. His emphasis on drowned sent a chill through me. Was it a warning or a threat? We were careful, I said, willing my voice not to shake. Vincent held my gaze for several long seconds before returning his attention to his food, methodically cutting another perfect square of chicken. Tomorrow's activity is survival skills, he said, changing the subject abruptly. Be prepared for extended time in the woods. Bring a water bottle and suitable footwear. He looked up, his eyes moving between Theo and me. And stay with the group at all times. It's easy to get lost out there if you wander off. The implied threat was unmistakable. As Vincent finished his meal and left the table, Theo leaned closer to me. Okay, he admitted in a low voice. That was definitely creepy. Maybe we should talk to Miss Winters again, together this time. I nodded, but doubt gnawed at me. Miss Winters had already dismissed my concerns once. Without concrete evidence, would a second complaint make any difference? And if Vincent found out we'd reported him again, what might he do? The dining hall suddenly felt too crowded, too loud. Through the windows I could see darkness settling over the camp, transforming the familiar grounds into shadowy territory where anything might lurk. In less than an hour, we would be back in cabin 7, trapped with Vincent through another long night. And I was becoming increasingly certain that Vincent had plans for us. Plans that had nothing to do with the official camp activities and everything to do with whatever dark impulses drove him to watch, wait, and isolate those who noticed his behavior. Thursday morning dawned with a heavy fog that clung to the camp like a shroud, reducing visibility to mere yards and muffling sounds. The effect was disorienting. Familiar pathways became mysterious, and the normal bustle of camp activity seemed distant and surreal. I had slept poorly, waking frequently to check that Vincent was in his bunk. He had been there each time I looked, lying unnaturally still with his eyes closed, though whether he was actually sleeping was impossible to tell. Once around 3 a.m., I thought I heard the soft scratch of pencil on paper, but when I cautiously raised my head to look, Vincent appeared motionless, the cabin dark and quiet save for the breathing of the other boys. Breakfast was a subdued affair. The fog had dampened everyone's spirits, and the announcement that most outdoor activities would be limited due to poor visibility didn't help. Instead of survival skills in the woods, our cabin would be confined to camp boundaries for the morning, participating in team-building exercises on the playing field near the lodge. Vincent seemed unusually agitated by the change in plans. He kept checking his watch and staring out the windows at the thick fog as if willing it to disperse. When Miss Winters approached him with revised activity schedules, I overheard fragments of their conversation. Not safe conditions for what I had planned, Miss Winters was saying. They need to learn to navigate in all conditions, Vincent responded, his voice tense. Controlling the environment defeats the purpose. Safety comes first, Vincent, Miss Winters said firmly. We'll reassess after lunch if the fog lifts. Vincent's expression darkened, but he nodded stiffly and returned to our table, informing us of the change with obvious displeasure. The team-building exercises were standard camp fare: trust falls, human knots, blindfolded obstacle courses. Vincent observed rather than participated, standing at the edge of the field with his arms crossed, occasionally making notes in his black notebook. His mood seemed to deteriorate as the morning progressed, his few instructions delivered in clipped tones. During a water break, Jake, one of the quieter boys in our cabin, approached me while I was refilling my bottle at a drinking fountain. "Hey," he said, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. "Is it just me, or is Vincent extra weird today?" "Definitely not just you," I confirmed, relieved that someone else had noticed. "He's been off all week, but today seems worse." Jake nodded, fidgeting with the hem of his t-shirt. "Last night, I got up to use the bathroom around 2, and I saw him sitting on his bunk just staring at us, not doing anything, just watching everyone sleep." He shuddered slightly at the memory. "And when he saw that I was awake, he put his finger to his lips like he was telling me to be quiet. It really freaked me out." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "Have you told anyone else?" "No," Jake admitted. "I thought maybe I was overreacting, or that I dreamed it." "You didn't," I assured him, then hesitated before adding, "There's more. He's been following me, watching me when he thinks I don't notice. And there was this incident by the river yesterday." I quickly recounted what had happened with Ivy, watching Jake's expression shift from concern to alarm. "We should tell Miss Winters," he said when I finished. "All of us who've noticed weird stuff. She can't ignore multiple reports, right?" "I already tried," I said, explaining my earlier conversation with the camp director. "She basically said Vincent is eccentric but qualified." Jake's face fell. "So what do we do? There's still 3 more days until pickup." "I'm working on it," I promised, though in truth, I had no plan beyond increased vigilance. "For now, stick with the group. Don't be alone with him. And tell me if you notice anything else strange." Jake agreed, and we rejoined the others for the final exercise before lunch. As we approached, Vincent's eyes locked onto us, narrowing slightly as if he sensed we'd been discussing him. He made a show of checking his notebook, then announced the next activity: a blindfolded challenge, where one team member would guide their blindfolded partner through a series of obstacles using only verbal instructions. "Jake and our photographer here will demonstrate first," Vincent declared, holding out a blindfold. The way he emphasized photographer made it clear this wasn't a random selection. Jake shot me a nervous glance as Vincent approached him with the blindfold. "Actually," a voice interrupted, "I need to borrow Jake for a moment." Miss Winters had appeared at the edge of the field, clipboard in hand. "We're rearranging some of the afternoon activities, and I need to confirm his preferences." Vincent's jaw tightened visibly, but he nodded, redirecting his attention to me. "It seems you need a new partner," he said, his voice deceptively mild. "I'll guide you myself." A protest rose in my throat, but before I could voice it, Vincent was already securing the blindfold over my eyes. The fabric was thick, blocking all light and disorienting me immediately. I felt Vincent's cold hands adjusting the knot at the back of my head, pulling it tighter than necessary. "Trust is essential in survival situations," Vincent said, his voice close to my ear. "When you can't rely on sight, you must depend entirely on others to guide you safely." The emphasis on safely sent a chill down my back. As Vincent led me toward what I assumed was the obstacle course, his hand gripped my upper arm with unnecessary force. "3 steps forward," he instructed, his voice now coming from behind me. I complied hesitantly, arms outstretched for balance. "Now, right, 2 steps." I turned and stepped as directed, acutely aware of how vulnerable I was. The sounds of the other campers seemed to fade, as if Vincent had deliberately led me away from the group. "Stop," he commanded sharply. I froze. "There's a log in front of you. Step over it, lifting your foot high." I raised my foot cautiously, feeling nothing beneath it. Had I cleared the obstacle? Before I could ask, Vincent spoke again, his voice suddenly much closer. "You didn't visit the office again yesterday," he said, the non sequitur catching me off guard. "After our chat by the river, I thought you might have more concerns to share with Miss Winters?" My mouth went dry. "No," I managed. "No concerns." "Good," Vincent replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice, though I couldn't see it. "Because concerns can be dangerous, especially unfounded ones." "Where's the next obstacle?" I asked, desperate to redirect the conversation. "Patience," Vincent said. "Before we continue, I want to make something clear. I've noticed you watching me just as I watch you. It's what counselors do: observe, assess, identify potential problems before they arise." His hand returned to my arm, fingers pressing into the same spot where he'd gripped me before. I would later discover bruises there, 5 distinct fingerprints marked on my skin. "But your observations are incomplete," he continued. "You see only fragments, without context. It leads to misunderstandings." I began, but Vincent cut me off. "3 steps left, then duck," he ordered, abruptly resuming the exercise. I complied, still unsure what obstacles I was avoiding, if any existed at all. "Now, reach out in front of you. There's a rope hanging. Grab it and use it to guide yourself forward." I extended my hands, finding nothing but air. "I don't feel anything." "It's there," Vincent insisted, his voice hardening. "Reach farther." I stretched my arms to their full extent, still encountering nothing. A growing suspicion that there was no rope, perhaps no obstacle course at all, filled me with fresh anxiety. What was Vincent's goal here? "I still don't—" "Because you're not trying," Vincent hissed, suddenly directly beside me. "Your lack of trust is the problem. If you trusted me properly, you'd find what you're looking for." His breath was hot against my ear, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you know what happens to campers who don't trust their counselors, who spread stories, who create division? They get lost. And in these woods, lost means, 'What's going on over here?'" The sharp voice of Miss Winters cut through whatever Vincent had been about to say. I tore off the blindfold to find we were indeed far from the main group, standing near the edge of the forest. The rest of Cabin 7 was visible in the distance, engaged in the actual obstacle course on the playing field. Vincent stepped away from me smoothly. "Just demonstrating an alternative approach to the blindfold exercise," he explained, his demeanor shifting instantly to professional detachment, "using natural obstacles rather than artificial ones." Miss Winters frowned, looking between us. "All activities need to remain within view of the main field today, Vincent. You know the fog protocol." "Of course," he agreed, his voice neutral. "An oversight on my part." As we walked back toward the group, Miss Winters beside us, I glanced at Vincent. His expression revealed nothing, but there was a tension in his posture, a coiled energy that hadn't been there before. "You'll need to check in with Nurse Patel," Miss Winters told me when we reached the field. "Standard procedure after any deviation from planned activities." I seized the opportunity to escape Vincent's presence, following Miss Winters toward the infirmary building. As we walked, I gathered my courage. "Miss Winters," I began, "about Vincent." "Nurse Patel will address any concerns," she interrupted, her tone businesslike but not unkind. "That's why we have these protocols." Something in her manner, a certain wariness perhaps, made me wonder if she suspected more than she had acknowledged. At the infirmary door, she paused. "Vincent has unique methods," she said carefully, "but until today, he's been scrupulous about following safety guidelines. I'll be keeping a closer eye on his activities." It wasn't the full acknowledgement I'd hoped for, but it was something, an indication that Vincent's behavior had finally triggered official notice. Nurse Patel, a brisk woman with kind eyes, checked me over efficiently, noting the finger-shaped marks beginning to form on my arm with a frown. "How did these happen?" she asked, gently probing the tender skin. "Vincent grabbed me during the blindfold exercise," I explained. "He was guiding me." She made a note on her clipboard, her expression carefully neutral. "And did he say anything unusual during this exercise?" The direct question surprised me. "He implied that campers who don't trust counselors get lost in the woods," I admitted, watching her reaction closely. Nurse Patel's pen paused momentarily, then continued writing. "Anything else?" I described the entire incident, including how Vincent had led me away from the group and the mind games with non-existent obstacles. With each detail, her frown deepened. "Thank you for being thorough," she said when I finished. "You're cleared to return to activities. But if you experience any discomfort or additional concerns, come back immediately." As I left the infirmary, I caught sight of her picking up a phone, her expression grave. A tiny flicker of hope ignited in my chest. Perhaps someone was finally taking the situation seriously. The fog had begun to lift by lunchtime, patches of blue sky visible through thinning mist. The improved weather brought a collective lifting of spirits among the campers, but I remained on edge, watching Vincent across the dining hall as he conferred with two other counselors, his manner subdued. I sought out Theo, who had been engaged in a different activity all morning, and filled him in on everything that had happened. His usual skepticism was gone, replaced by genuine concern. "That's assault," he said, eyeing the marks on my arm. "They have to do something now." "I'm not sure they will," I replied. "Or at least not quickly enough. Something's happening soon, Theo. Vincent had specific plans for today that got derailed by the fog. He was really upset about it." "What kind of plans?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but they involve taking us deep into the woods, away from supervision." Theo's expression darkened. "We need to stick together, all of us from the cabin. Safety in numbers, right?" I nodded, though I wasn't convinced even that would be enough. Throughout lunch, I could feel Vincent's eyes on me, calculating, reassessing. Whatever game he was playing, the rules had changed, and I had a sinking feeling that I had accelerated his timeline rather than derailed it. The afternoon brought more structured activities within camp boundaries, with Vincent notably absent. Miss Winters explained that he was attending to administrative matters, but the careful way she avoided elaborating suggested there was more to the story. I spotted Ivy during an arts and crafts session and managed to speak with her briefly, updating her on the morning's events. "They're questioning him," she revealed in a hushed voice. "Amber saw him going into the administrative cabin with Miss Winters and some guy in a polo shirt she didn't recognize." "Good," I said, relief washing over me. "Maybe they'll send him home." Ivy's expression remained troubled. "Maybe, but if they don't, if he comes back..." She didn't need to finish the thought. "I'll be careful," I promised. "We all will." As dinner approached, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain overnight. The darkening sky seemed an apt metaphor for the mounting tension I felt. Vincent still hadn't returned, his absence at the counselor's table conspicuous. Rumors spread quickly through the camp. Vincent had been fired, he'd quit, he'd been arrested, each version more dramatic than the last. I didn't believe any of them. Something told me Vincent wouldn't leave so easily, wouldn't relinquish whatever plans he had set in motion. Back in cabin 7 that evening, a temporary counselor named Greg supervised our nighttime routine, explaining that Vincent was taking care of personal matters and would return tomorrow. Greg was everything Vincent wasn't: cheerful, talkative, genuinely interested in our camp experiences. Under different circumstances, his presence would have been a welcome relief. Instead, it felt like the calm before a storm. As I lay in my bunk that night, listening to the first raindrops pattering against the cabin roof, I couldn't shake the conviction that Vincent was out there somewhere in the darkness, watching, waiting, planning his next move. I must have eventually fallen asleep despite my anxiety because I jerked awake sometime in the deepest part of the night, disoriented and unsure what had roused me. The cabin was dark and quiet, rain now falling steadily outside. Greg's gentle snoring came from Vincent's usual bunk by the door. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping on the window nearest my bed. 3 distinct taps, a pause, then 3 more. Frozen with fear, I stared into the darkness, barely breathing. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, half expecting to see Vincent's pale face pressed against the glass. Instead, there was only darkness and the streaming rivulets of rain. But as lightning briefly illuminated the night, I caught a glimpse of something white affixed to the outside of the window. A piece of paper, rapidly becoming sodden in the downpour. My instinct was to wake Theo or Greg, but curiosity overcame fear. I slipped silently from my bunk and approached the window, straining to make out what was written on the paper. Another flash of lightning revealed a message in neat, precise handwriting. "Meet me at the boathouse. Come alone. Information about Vincent." The note wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Only one person at camp knew about my suspicions and might have information to share. Ivy. But why the boathouse? Why in the middle of the night during a storm? Logic told me to ignore the note, to return to bed and wait for morning. But the possibility of learning something concrete about Vincent, something that might finally convince the camp administration to remove him permanently, was too tempting to dismiss. I stood at the window for long minutes, debating. Safety in numbers, Theo had said, but waking him or Greg would mean explaining the note, which would likely result in both of them insisting we ignore it or report it officially. Options that might mean losing whatever information Ivy had discovered. Decision made, I quietly dressed, pulled on a rain jacket, and slipped my flashlight into my pocket. The cabin door creaked slightly as I eased it open, but Greg's snoring continued uninterrupted. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, instantly soaking my pants despite the jacket's protection. The path to the boathouse was dark and slippery, visibility reduced to mere feet ahead. This was madness, I told myself, as I carefully picked my way down the muddy trail. What kind of vital information couldn't wait until morning? Yet I continued, driven by a mix of curiosity and the growing conviction that time was running out, that whatever Vincent had planned was imminent. The boathouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the storm-lashed lake. Its wooden structure creaked and groaned in the wind, an eerie chorus that raised goosebumps on my arms despite the relative warmth of the summer night. The door stood slightly ajar, a thin line of light visible from within. "Ivy," I called softly, pushing the door open wider. The interior was dimly lit by a single battery-powered lantern placed on the floor near the back, illuminating the upturned hulls of canoes stored for the night. "Are you here?" No response. I stepped fully inside, relieved to be out of the rain but increasingly uneasy. The boathouse smelled of damp wood and mildew, the sound of water slapping against the dock beneath the floorboards creating a rhythmic counterpoint to the rain on the roof. "Hello?" I tried again, taking a few more steps inside. "Ivy, is anyone here?" The door slammed shut behind me with a force that couldn't have been merely the wind. I whirled around, heart hammering in my chest, as the lantern's light glinted off a familiar tall figure now standing between me and the exit. "Curious," Vincent said, his voice eerily calm above the storm's clamor. "I left that note over an hour ago. I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." The air in the boathouse seemed to thicken, making each breath a conscious effort. Vincent remained by the door, his silhouette backlit by occasional flashes of lightning through the small windows. Water streamed from his rain-soaked clothes, forming a dark puddle at his feet. "Where's Ivy?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. My eyes darted around the dimly lit space, searching for escape routes. Vincent tilted his head slightly, regarding me with clinical interest. "Ivy? She's not here. She was never here." A smile spread across his face, devoid of warmth. "Did you think she sent that note? An interesting assumption." My mind raced. If Ivy hadn't sent the note, if this was Vincent's trap all along, why had I so readily believed otherwise? The answer came with sickening clarity. Because I wanted to believe someone had information that could help. Because I'd underestimated Vincent's cunning. "What do you want?" I asked, taking a step backward as Vincent moved away from the door, circling slowly to my right. "A chance to clear up misunderstandings," he replied, his tone conversational, as if we were chatting over breakfast. "You've been watching me, asking questions, spreading concerns among the other campers." He sighed, a theatrical sound. "It's becoming disruptive." "I haven't spread anything," I countered, continuing to back away, keenly aware of the layout of the boathouse, the heavy canoes suspended from the ceiling, the equipment racks lining the walls, the narrow walkway leading to the dock door at the rear. "I've just noticed things." "Yes, you notice a great deal," Vincent acknowledged, his pace matching mine, maintaining a consistent distance between us. "More than most. That's what caught my attention first. Your awareness, your vigilance." He pronounced the word with something like admiration. "Most teenagers are oblivious to their surroundings, absorbed in their phones, their social dramas, their petty concerns, but not you." A flash of lightning illuminated his face fully for an instant. The hollow cheeks, the intense eyes, the smile that never reached them. In that moment, he looked more predatory than human. "Why did you bring me here?" I asked, desperately trying to buy time to formulate a plan. The dock door was my best option, but Vincent seemed to anticipate this, his movements deliberately herding me away from that escape route. "To talk, without interruption or interference," Vincent replied. "Miss Winters and her associate had many questions today about my methods, my background, my interactions with campers." His expression hardened. "Questions inspired by your visit to the infirmary, no doubt." "You hurt me," I said, rubbing my arm where the bruises still marked his grip. "Nurse Patel was doing her job." Vincent waved dismissively. "A misunderstanding. I was ensuring your safety during the exercise." He took another step closer, forcing me to retreat further into the shadows at the back of the boathouse. "But these concerns have complicated my position here, accelerated certain timelines." The way he said timelines sent fresh adrenaline coursing through my system. Whatever Vincent had planned, it was happening now, tonight, triggered by the administrative intervention earlier in the day. "They'll notice I'm gone," I said, grasping for leverage. "Greg will check the bunks. They'll come looking." "Eventually," Vincent conceded with a small nod, "but not until morning, and by then, our lesson will be complete." "Lesson?" The word hung in the air between us, ominous in its ambiguity. Vincent's expression shifted, becoming almost earnest. "That's what this has always been about, teaching. Not the superficial lessons of summer camp, how to paddle a canoe or string a bow, but the essential lessons of survival, of awareness." He gestured around the dark boathouse. "Like this moment, a test of your ability to recognize danger, to respond appropriately." "By luring me out alone in the middle of the night," I countered, anger briefly overriding fear. "That's not teaching, that's—" "What?" Vincent interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. "Predatory? Criminal? Choose your words carefully. You came here voluntarily, driven by your own curiosity and hubris." He wasn't wrong, and that realization stung. I had walked into his trap, ignoring every warning sign, every instinct that had served me well until now. "What happened at Lakeside Camp?" I asked, a sudden intuition guiding the question. "In Vermont, before you came here." Vincent went very still, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "What do you know about Lakeside?" "Miss Winters said you came highly recommended from there," I said, watching his reaction closely. "But something happened, didn't it? Something like this." For the first time, Vincent's composure slipped, a flash of something, anger, fear, crossing his features before the mask of calm returned. "Lakeside was educational for everyone involved." "What does that mean?" I pressed, sensing I'd found a vulnerable point. Vincent ignored the question, abruptly changing tactics. He moved suddenly to the right, cutting off my slow progress toward the equipment racks where I'd spotted a potential weapon, a heavy paddle hanging on the wall. "Enough about the past," he said. "Let's focus on the present, on your current predicament." He gestured toward the door. "You could run. Try to make it back to your cabin before I catch you. The rain would cover any noise." The implicit threat hung in the air between us. Vincent stood between me and the main door, and though the dock door remained a possibility, I'd have to get past him, or risk being trapped on the dock with nowhere to go but the storm-tossed lake. "Or," Vincent continued when I didn't respond, "you could listen, learn, understand what this has all been about." "Which is what, exactly?" I asked, desperately scanning the boathouse for anything that might help me. My gaze landed on a red emergency alarm box near the main door. too far away to reach, but its presence confirmed that the boathouse had safety protocols in place. Vincent smiled, seemingly pleased by the question. Recognition, potential. In all my years working with teenagers, I've encountered very few with your level of awareness, your instinctive understanding of danger. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur despite the storm's noise. From the moment you arrived, you sensed what I was, what I could do. The hairs on my arms stood on end, not from cold, but from the clinical detachment with which Vincent discussed my potential, as if I were a specimen to be studied rather than a person to be protected. "And what exactly are you?" I asked, stalling while I inched toward a stack of life jackets piled on a bench, thinking they might provide some protection if Vincent attacked. "A teacher," he replied simply. "One who understands that true learning doesn't come from safe, structured activities. It comes from fear, from danger, from confronting the darkest aspects of human nature." His eyes gleamed in the dim light, from recognizing predators before they strike. In that moment, everything clicked into place. Vincent's obsession with danger, his isolation of vulnerable campers, the tests and mind games. He saw himself not as a threat, but as some twisted kind of mentor, teaching survival through terror. "You're sick," I said, the words escaping before I could reconsider. "You need help." Vincent's expression darkened. "That's what they said at Lakeside. That's what they always say when they don't understand." He moved suddenly, closing the distance between us with alarming speed. "But you understand, don't you? You've felt it, the heightened awareness, the clarity that comes with fear. I've watched you these past days, seen how your senses have sharpened, how quickly you've learned to recognize threats." I backed away until I felt the rough wood of the wall behind me. Vincent stood less than an arm's length away now, his breathing quick and shallow with excitement or anger. I couldn't tell which. "This isn't teaching," I insisted, desperately searching for words that might reach whatever rationality remained in his disturbed mind. "Teaching is about trust, about safety, not whatever this is." "Trust?" Vincent scoffed. "Safety? Those are illusions, comforting lies we tell children. The world isn't safe. It's full of people like me, watching, waiting, selecting." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And most people never notice until it's too late. But you noticed. From the beginning, you saw me." A plan was forming in my mind, not elegant, but born of desperate necessity. The heavy flashlight in my pocket, the emergency alarm by the door, the dock behind me. If I could momentarily blind Vincent, make a dash for the alarm. "So what now?" I asked, hand slipping into my pocket to grip the flashlight. "What happens when your lesson is over?" Vincent straightened, considering the question with apparent sincerity. "That depends on you, on what you've learned, on whether you've earned the right to carry this knowledge forward." The implication was clear. If Vincent decided I hadn't learned properly, I wouldn't be leaving the boathouse at all. The storm would provide cover, the lake a convenient disposal site. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs as I realized the full extent of the danger I was in. "And if I have learned?" I managed to ask, fingers tightening around the flashlight. "Then perhaps you become the teacher," Vincent replied, his expression brightening with an almost religious fervor. "Perhaps you carry forward this understanding, this awareness. Perhaps—" I didn't wait for him to finish. In one fluid motion, I yanked the flashlight from my pocket, switched it on, and shone the bright beam directly into Vincent's eyes. He recoiled instinctively, raising an arm to shield his face, and I seized the moment to lunge past him, aiming for the main door. But Vincent recovered faster than I anticipated. His hand shot out, grabbing the hood of my rain jacket and yanking me backward with enough force to tear the fabric. I stumbled, off balance, and he used the momentum to slam me against the wall, knocking the wind from my lungs. The flashlight clattered to the floor, rolling away and casting wild shadows across the boathouse. Vincent's face loomed close to mine, all pretense of calm instruction gone, replaced by cold fury. "That," he hissed, "was disappointing. After everything I've invested in your education." His hand closed around my throat, not squeezing but present, a threat, a promise. With my back literally against the wall, options disappearing by the second, I did the only thing I could think of. I brought my knee up sharply, connecting with Vincent's groin with as much force as I could muster. The effect was instantaneous. Vincent doubled over with a guttural sound of pain, his grip on my throat releasing as he staggered backward. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and throwing myself out into the storm. Rain lashed at my face as I ran, the muddy path treacherous underfoot. Behind me, I heard the boathouse door slam open again, followed by Vincent's voice, raised to a shout for the first time since I'd known him. "You can't escape this," he called after me, his words nearly lost in a crash of thunder. "The lesson isn't over." I didn't look back, focusing all my energy on the path ahead, on reaching the safety of the main camp. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the grounds, the dark shapes of cabins, the looming trees, the puddles rapidly becoming small ponds in the torrential downpour. My lungs burned, my legs threatened to give out, but terror drove me forward. The lights of the main lodge appeared through the rain, a beacon of hope. Someone was still awake despite the late hour. I changed course, heading for the lighted windows rather than my dark cabin. Behind me, I could hear splashing footsteps, Vincent in pursuit. The lodge steps were slick with rain, and I nearly fell as I scrambled up them, throwing myself against the heavy wooden door. It didn't budge. Locked. I pounded frantically, screaming for help over the storm's roar. "Help, please! Someone help me!" Vincent's figure emerged from the darkness at the base of the steps, moving with deliberate purpose despite his obvious pain. His face, illuminated by another flash of lightning, was transformed by rage. All pretense of the controlled counselor stripped away to reveal something feral beneath. "No one can hear you," he called, starting up the steps. "The storm's too loud. We can continue our lesson elsewhere." Desperation lending me strength, I ran along the lodge's covered porch, trying each window, looking for any way in. The third window yielded slightly, not locked. I forced my fingers into the narrow gap and pushed upward with all my might. The window groaned, then slid up enough for me to squeeze through. I tumbled into what appeared to be the lodge kitchen, knocking over a chair in the process. The noise seemed deafening after the constant roar of the storm. I scrambled to my feet, dripping water onto the linoleum floor, and rushed toward the door that would lead to the main hall. Before I could reach it, the door swung open, revealing a startled Miss Winters in a bathrobe, a baseball bat clutched in her hands. "What on earth?" she began, then registered my soaked appearance, my wild eyes, my gasping breath. "What happened?" "Vincent," I managed between desperate gulps of air. "Boathouse, trapped me, tried to—" I couldn't finish, the reality of what had nearly happened hitting me all at once. Miss Winters' expression hardened. She reached for a phone on the wall, dialing quickly. "Stay here," she instructed, her voice calm but authoritative. "Don't move." As she spoke rapidly into the phone, I sank to the floor, adrenaline ebbing to leave me shaking and nauseated. Through the window I'd entered, I could see the porch was empty, no sign of Vincent. Had he fled when he realized I'd gotten inside? Or was he still out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity? The next hours passed in a blur. Security personnel arrived, followed by local police. I repeated my story multiple times. The note, the boathouse, Vincent's strange philosophy of teaching through fear, his threats, my escape. Somewhere in the midst of it all, dawn broke, the storm finally passing to leave a sodden, debris-strewn camp in its wake. They found evidence in the boathouse that corroborated my account. The lantern still burning, my broken flashlight on the floor, a torn piece of my jacket's hood. But of Vincent himself, there was no sign. A search of his quarters revealed the black notebook, filled with detailed observations of multiple campers, not just me, but others he had identified as aware or potential candidates. Most disturbing were the final pages where Vincent had outlined a graduation exercise scheduled for that night. Details vague but ominous, involving the boathouse, the lake, and tests of survival under extreme conditions. As morning fully arrived, parents were contacted, arrangements made for early pickups. Camp was effectively over, the idyllic summer experience shattered by the realization that a predator had been among us, hiding behind the facade of authority. Theo found me in the infirmary, where Nurse Patel had insisted I rest after giving my statement. His face was pale, his usual easygoing manner replaced by wide-eyed shock. "Is it true?" he asked, perching on the edge of the cot where I lay. "About Vincent? They're saying that he was planning to—" "It's true," I confirmed, too exhausted for euphemisms or sugarcoating. He had this twisted idea that he was teaching survival skills by creating real danger, by becoming the predator. Theo shook his head in disbelief. "And the police haven't found him?" "Not yet." The thought sent a chill through me despite the warm blanket Nurse Patel had provided. "They think he's long gone, that he ran when he realized I'd gotten away and raised the alarm. But you don't believe that," Theo observed, reading my expression. I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, Vincent doesn't strike me as the type to just give up. Not when he was so invested in his lesson." Theo's hand found mine, squeezing gently. "Well, he can't get to you now. There are police everywhere, and our parents will be here in a few hours." I nodded, wanting to believe he was right. But as I looked out the infirmary window at the campgrounds, now crawling with authorities, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That somewhere Vincent was watching, evaluating my response, considering it part of his twisted curriculum. That feeling would stay with me long after we left Pine Ridge, long after the police investigation concluded without finding Vincent, long after the summer faded into autumn, and life supposedly returned to normal. It would wake me from nightmares, prompt me to check locked doors and windows, make me search crowds for a tall, pale figure with dead eyes. Because Vincent had been right about one thing. I had learned. I had become aware in ways I never would have chosen, and I would never feel entirely safe again. The next 24 hours passed in a chaotic blur of police statements, tearful parents arriving to collect their shaken children, and news vans gathering at the camp entrance like vultures sensing carrion. My parents arrived by mid-afternoon, my mother's face white with terror, my father uncharacteristically silent as I was released into their custody. The drive home was mostly quiet. I'd already told my story so many times, to Miss Winters, to the police, to state troopers, to detectives, that my voice was hoarse and my mind numb. My parents respected this, limiting their questions to my immediate well-being rather than pressing for details of the night's events. "We're just glad you're safe," my mother said, reaching back from the passenger seat to squeeze my knee. Her hand trembled slightly, betraying the calm she was trying to project. "That's all that matters now." But I wasn't safe, not really. That was the lesson Vincent had taught me, the awareness he'd awakened that couldn't be unlearned. The world contained predators who watched and waited, who could wear masks of normalcy so convincing that institutions trusted them with children. And sometimes, those predators chose you, saw something in you that caught their interest, marked you as different from the general herd. I didn't share these thoughts with my parents. Instead, I leaned my head against the car window, watching the familiar landscape of home replace the wilderness of Pine Ridge, and tried to convince myself that distance equaled safety. Home should have felt like a sanctuary, but it didn't. I found myself checking locks, scanning rooms before entering them, startling at unexpected sounds. Sleep became a luxury, interrupted by nightmares in which Vincent's pale face loomed out of darkness, his voice whispering about lessons unfinished, tests yet to come. 3 days after our return, Detective Garrett came to our house. She was a compact woman with shrewd eyes and a gentle manner that belied her obvious competence. She sat at our kitchen table, declining coffee but accepting water, and explained the status of the investigation. "We've identified him as Vincent Mercer, age 27, she began, placing a photograph on the table. Vincent's staff ID picture, his empty smile frozen in glossy color. His employment history is spotty, but he did work at Lakeside Camp in Vermont as he claimed. What he didn't mention was that he left under suspicious circumstances after a camper reported similar behavior: isolation, surveillance, psychological intimidation. Why wasn't he arrested then? My father demanded, anger briefly overriding his usual restraint. Detective Garrett's expression tightened. The camper recanted his statement after Vincent confronted him privately. Without corroborating evidence or a complainant, the case was dropped, but Lakeside did terminate his employment. So he just moved to another state and started over, my mother said, horror evident in her voice. With a recommendation. Not exactly, the detective clarified. The recommendation Pine Ridge received was forged. Vincent created a paper trail that seemed legitimate enough to pass a standard background check, but not the deeper investigation we're conducting now. She turned to me, her voice gentling. I know you're tired of telling this story, but I need to ask you about something specific. In your statement, you mentioned Vincent talked about potential candidates and seemed to think you had some special awareness. Can you elaborate on that? I tried to organize my thoughts, to convey the essence of Vincent's disturbing philosophy. He said most people are oblivious to danger until it's too late, that they don't notice predators watching them. I swallowed hard, remembering his intensity in the boathouse. He seemed to think I was different because I noticed him, because I saw through whatever act he was putting on for everyone else. And this, recognition, made you valuable to him somehow? Detective Garrett pressed, watching me carefully. I think he saw it as potential, I explained, struggling to articulate the concept, like he could shape me into something, turn me into someone like him maybe. He talked about me becoming the teacher eventually. A shadow passed over the detective's face, quickly suppressed. That aligns with what we found in his notebook and personal effects at the camp. Vincent appears to have developed an elaborate philosophy around identifying what he called naturally vigilant individuals and testing their responses to escalating threat scenarios. Testing, my father repeated, his voice hollow. You mean terrorizing? Yes, Detective Garrett agreed simply. The notebook contains observations on multiple campers across 2 summers, but your son's entries were by far the most extensive and recent. Vincent seemed particularly fixated on his reactions. The knowledge that I had been under such close, calculated surveillance made my skin crawl anew. I thought of all the times I'd felt watched, all the moments when Vincent had appeared silently, observing from a distance. Have you found him? I asked, the question that had been haunting me since that night in the boathouse. Detective Garrett's hesitation was answer enough, but she replied anyway. Not yet. We've issued alerts across multiple states, frozen his known accounts, and are monitoring all possible points of contact. But Vincent appears to have prepared for this contingency. He had a go-bag ready in his vehicle, which we found abandoned about 20 miles from the camp, and likely had alternate identification prepared. So he could be anywhere, my mother said, voicing the fear we all shared. He could, the detective acknowledged. But people like Vincent typically follow patterns. His focus on your son was intense and prolonged. That kind of fixation doesn't disappear overnight. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Vincent might come looking for me, might try to complete whatever twisted lesson he'd planned. Detective Garrett seemed to read this realization in our expressions. We're taking precautions, she assured us. Your house will have regular patrols, and we've alerted local authorities to maintain heightened awareness in your area. We're also providing a panic button system that connects directly to emergency dispatch. She pulled a small device from her pocket, demonstrating its function. This is for you, she said, handing it to me. Keep it with you at all times. The small weight of the panic button in my palm should have been reassuring. Concrete evidence that I was being protected, that systems were in place to keep me safe. Instead, it felt like confirmation of my deepest fear, that Vincent was still out there, that the danger hadn't passed with my escape from the boathouse. As Detective Garrett prepared to leave, she paused at the door, her professional demeanor softening slightly. For what it's worth, she said, meeting my eyes directly. What you did that night, recognizing the danger, escaping, raising the alarm, it likely saved other campers from becoming Vincent's targets. That kind of awareness, that instinct you have, it's not something he can claim or corrupt. It's yours, and it served you well. Her words stayed with me in the weeks that followed, a counterpoint to the fear that had become my constant companion. Perhaps there was value in the vigilance Vincent had tried to twist into something dark. Perhaps it could be reclaimed, redirected into something protective rather than paranoid. Summer faded into fall, and gradually the acute terror began to subside into a more manageable wariness. I returned to school, moved through familiar routines, reconnected with friends who knew nothing of what had happened at Pine Ridge. The police patrols became less frequent as weeks passed without any sign of Vincent, though the panic button remained a constant presence in my pocket. Theo and I spoke often, our shared experience creating a bond that went beyond our previous friendship. He seemed to process the trauma differently, more outwardly, more verbally, talking through each detail as if repetition could render it harmless. I preferred to internalize, to analyze privately, to work through my fear in solitude. I also stayed in touch with Ivy, whose perspective as another of Vincent's observed campers helped me understand that his fixation hadn't been entirely unique to me. We compared notes, shared nightmares, and gradually built a fuller picture of Vincent's methodology across both summers he'd worked at Pine Ridge. He started watching me last year, she told me during one of our video calls, her face serious on my laptop screen. Nothing as intense as what you experienced, but the same pattern. Appearing unexpectedly, asking strange hypothetical questions about survival, testing boundaries. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I asked, without accusation. Ivy shrugged, a helpless gesture. "For the same reason most people don't, I guess. It was weird, but not definitively threatening, and without proof." She trailed off, then added, "Plus, there's that thing where you start to doubt yourself, to wonder if you're overreacting." I understood exactly what she meant. That self-doubt had nearly cost me everything in the boathouse. "The investigators found a list in his stuff," I told her, sharing information Detective Garrett had recently disclosed. Names of campers he thought had potential. You were on it. So was Jake from my cabin. Ivy went quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "And you were at the top, I'm guessing?" I nodded, the knowledge still unsettling despite weeks of trying to process it. Apparently, I was his most promising student. Lucky me. "Not luck," Ivy countered firmly. "You saw him for what he was right away. That's why he focused on you. Because you weren't an easy target. Because you challenged his control." There was some comfort in this perspective, that Vincent's attention had been drawn not by weakness but by strength, by an awareness he couldn't easily manipulate. It suggested that whatever he'd seen in me wasn't something to be ashamed of or suppressed, but rather something to be understood and directed purposefully. October brought the first significant development in the investigation. Detective Garrett called to inform us that Vincent's laptop had been recovered from a storage unit rented under a false name in a neighboring state. The contents were disturbing. Extensive notes on his educational philosophy, detailed profiles of past students at various camps, and a journal documenting his own formative experiences. It appears Vincent himself was the victim of a similar predator in his youth, Detective Garrett explained during her follow-up visit. A camp counselor who singled him out for what he called special lessons in survival and awareness. The journal suggests Vincent came to identify with this mentor, to internalize his methods and expand upon them. He was recreating his own trauma, my mother murmured, the psychologist in her recognizing the pattern. In his mind, he was improving upon it, the detective confirmed, creating a more sophisticated system for identifying and testing what he called naturally vigilant individuals. Your son represented something of a culmination of this work, someone who detected the threat immediately but remained within reach, allowing Vincent to escalate his lessons more gradually than with previous subjects. The laptop yielded another crucial piece of information, evidence of recent online activity suggesting Vincent had fled to Canada immediately after the boathouse incident. Border authorities were alerted, international warrants issued. For the first time since that rainy night, I felt a tentative hope that Vincent might actually be caught, that the shadow hanging over my life might eventually lift. But even as external circumstances improved, my internal landscape remained altered. I had changed in ways both subtle and profound. I found myself instinctively noting exits in new environments, evaluating strangers with a depth of attention I'd never before possessed, creating mental maps of safe spaces and potential hazards wherever I went. In therapy, which my parents had insisted upon, and which I had reluctantly come to value, I learned to channel these new instincts constructively, to distinguish between hypervigilance and healthy awareness. My therapist, Dr. Karim, helped me understand that trauma changes the brain's threat detection systems, heightening sensitivity to potential danger. The goal isn't to eliminate this awareness, she explained during one session. It's to integrate it in a way that enhances rather than diminishes your life, to find balance between caution and paralysis. Slowly, with practice and patience, I began to find that balance. The nightmares became less frequent. I could enter new spaces without immediately scanning for threats. I stopped checking the locks multiple times before bed. Small victories, but meaningful ones. November brought snow earlier than usual, transforming the world outside my window into something pristine and quiet. I was sitting at my desk, working on a history assignment, when my phone buzzed with a text from Detective Garrett. A request for my parents and me to come to the station at our earliest convenience. No explanation, just the simple request. But my heart immediately accelerated. At the station, Detective Garrett led us to a small conference room rather than her usual desk in the bullpen. A change that signaled the importance of whatever she had to share. "We have news," she began without preamble once we were seated. "Vincent Mercer was arrested yesterday in Vancouver. He was using an assumed name, working as a private wilderness guide for teens." The relief that flooded through me was so intense it was almost painful. A physical sensation of release after months of sustained tension. My mother reached for my hand, squeezing tightly. "Is it definitely him?" my father asked, ever the pragmatist. "You're certain?" "Fingerprints and DNA confirm it," Detective Garrett assured us. "There's no doubt. He's in custody and will be extradited to face charges here." "What kind of charges?" I asked, finding my voice. "What will happen to him?" The detective's expression was carefully neutral. "Multiple counts of endangering the welfare of minors, false imprisonment, assault, criminal threatening, identity fraud, and potentially attempted kidnapping. The prosecutor believes we have a strong case, particularly with the evidence from the laptop and your testimony." "Will I have to see him again?" The question slipped out before I could consider it fully. The fear that had lurked beneath all others. "Eventually, yes, if the case goes to trial," Detective Garrett acknowledged. "But that's months away, and we'll prepare you thoroughly if it comes to that. For now, Vincent is in custody and will remain there. He's not getting out on bail given the severity of the charges and the flight risk he represents." She slid a photograph across the table, Vincent's mugshot, taken in the hours after his arrest. He looked thinner than I remembered, his hair shorter, but his eyes retained that same unsettling intensity, that same calculating assessment of the camera and whoever might be viewing the image he projected. "I thought seeing this might help make it real for you," Detective Garrett explained. "Concrete evidence that he can't hurt you or anyone else now." I stared at the image, feeling a complex mixture of emotions, relief, vindication, lingering fear, and something unexpected, pity. Not for the man Vincent had become, but for the boy he once was, subjected to his own version of the terror he later inflicted. The cycle of trauma made visible in one damaged life. "Thank you," I said finally, pushing the photograph back toward the detective. "For finding him, for believing me from the beginning." "Believing victims is part of the job," she replied simply. "But for what it's worth, your account was always credible, detailed, consistent, corroborated by physical evidence and witness statements. You did everything right, from the moment you first noticed something was off about him. As we left the station, the weight that had pressed on my shoulders since that night in the boathouse felt marginally lighter. Vincent was in custody. The immediate threat had been neutralized. Justice would presumably be served through proper legal channels. But the lasting impact of those days at Pine Ridge, the awareness Vincent had sought to cultivate through fear, remained with me, embedded in my perceptions and responses. I would never again move through the world with the oblivious confidence of someone who hasn't encountered predatory intent. I would always notice too much, sense too keenly, evaluate too thoroughly. In the months that followed, I came to recognize this heightened awareness not as Vincent's successful teaching, but as my own hard-won wisdom, purchased at a cost I would never have willingly paid, but valuable nonetheless. Like a vaccine derived from the disease itself, my experience with Vincent had cultivated resistance to future threats, an ability to recognize danger in its earliest, most subtle manifestations. And as winter yielded to spring, I began to reclaim spaces I had avoided, to expand the boundaries of what felt safe, to trust my instincts without being ruled by them. I joined a wilderness survival class, ironic given Vincent's fixation on such skills, but empowering in its controlled environment and legitimate instruction. I reconnected with Theo and other friends from before Pine Ridge, balancing new wariness with old connections. Vincent's trial was scheduled for the following September, a date that loomed in my mind like a final examination, a culmination of everything I had processed and learned. I would face him again, would speak my truth in a courtroom, would close that chapter with the full weight of law and community behind me. But regardless of legal outcomes, I had already reached my own verdict on Vincent's twisted philosophy. Awareness born of terror isn't education, it's trauma. True learning comes from understanding danger without being consumed by it, from recognizing threats without becoming obsessed with them, from maintaining vigilance without surrendering joy. That balance between awareness and paranoia, between caution and paralysis, became my ongoing work, my personal curriculum in the aftermath of Pine Ridge. And unlike Vincent's brutal lessons, it was one I chose for myself, defined on my own terms, directed toward a future where fear informed but did not dominate my perception of the world around me. 1 year after Pine Ridge, I stood at the edge of a different lake, watching sunlight dance across its surface. This wasn't a camp, just a weekend trip with Theo and his family to their lakeside cabin. But the similarities were enough to trigger a cascade of memories: the smell of pine, the lapping of water against the shore, the sense of isolation from the normal rhythms of life. "You okay?" Theo asked, appearing at my side with fishing gear in hand. He'd become attuned to my moments of withdrawal, the brief intervals when present reality receded and Pine Ridge resurfaced. "I'm good," I assured him, meaning it despite the momentary disorientation. "Just remembering." Theo nodded, understanding without requiring elaboration. The year had changed him too, made him more perceptive, more patient, less inclined to dismiss concerns that didn't align with his own experience. Vincent's shadow had touched him as well, if less directly. "Dad's grilling tonight," he said after a comfortable silence. "Want to help me catch something worth cooking, or should we admit defeat and defrost the backup hamburgers?" The normalcy of the question, the easy humor, pulled me firmly back into the present. "Let's give it an hour," I suggested. "If the fish aren't biting by then, we surrender with dignity." As we settled into familiar positions on the small dock, casting lines into the clear water, I reflected on the distance I'd traveled since that night in the boathouse. Vincent's trial had concluded 2 months earlier, a surprisingly brief affair once his lawyers realized the strength of the evidence against him. He had accepted a plea deal, 15 years with no possibility of parole for 10, plus mandatory psychiatric treatment. I had been prepared to testify, had rehearsed my statement countless times with the prosecutor and victim advocates. But in the end, my in-person testimony wasn't needed. Vincent's own writings, the physical evidence, and the statements from multiple campers across several summers proved sufficient to convince both the court and his own legal team that fighting the charges would only result in a longer sentence. The only time I saw him in person was during the sentencing hearing, where victims were permitted to deliver impact statements. I had debated whether to attend at all, whether seeing Vincent again would undo months of healing and recovery, but ultimately I chose to go, not for closure, which I'd learned was more process than event, but for reclamation. To take back some small measure of power from the man who had tried to reshape me according to his distorted vision. Vincent had looked smaller in the courtroom than in my memory, diminished by the orange jumpsuit, by the circumstances that had stripped away his carefully constructed authority. But his eyes remained the same, moving over the assembled victims and families with that familiar clinical assessment, as if even here, even now, we remained subjects in his ongoing study of human fear responses. My statement was brief but direct. I spoke not of terror or trauma, though both were real and lasting, but of the perversion of teaching that Vincent had embodied. A true teacher, I had said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, empowers students to grow beyond their limitations, to become more fully themselves. You sought the opposite, to break us down, to remake us in your image, to exploit our natural instincts for your own gratification. You called it education. The court recognizes it as abuse, and I recognize it as the desperate act of someone who can only feel powerful by making others feel powerless. Vincent's expression hadn't changed as I spoke. That same flat affect, that same empty smile. But something had flickered briefly in his eyes when I mentioned power. Recognition, perhaps, or the irritation of being so transparently understood by someone he had viewed merely as a subject, a potential protege. The judge had thanked me for my statement, and I had returned to my seat between my parents, trembling slightly but unbroken. Vincent had watched me the entire way, his gaze heavy with unspoken thoughts. It was the last time I would see him in person, though not the last time I would confront his influence in my life. Earth to daydreamer, Theo's voice cut through my reverie. You've got a bite. I snapped back to the present, feeling the telltale tug on my fishing line. The moment of distraction nearly cost me the catch, but muscle memory took over as I played the fish carefully, eventually landing a respectable base that Theo's father would later declare almost worth the effort of cleaning. That evening, as we sat around a campfire beside the lake, something shifted subtly in my perception. The dancing flames, the darkening woods, the occasional distant sounds of wildlife, elements that might once have triggered hypervigilance and anxiety, instead created a backdrop of natural comfort. I was aware of my surroundings, yes, but not consumed by them, present without being paranoid. Vincent would have called it regression, a return to the complacency he so despised. I recognized it as healing, the integration of awareness without the paralysis of fear, the ability to sit in a setting similar to Pine Ridge and experience not just the echoes of trauma, but the simple pleasure of friendship, family, and natural beauty. The conversation around the fire drifted toward future plans, college applications, potential majors, the impending transitions that would reshape our lives in the coming year. Theo's younger sister was peppering her parents with questions about campus tours, and I found myself genuinely engaged in the discussion, offering suggestions based on my own research. "What about you?" Theo's mother asked me during a lull. "Have you decided on a major yet?" The question was innocent, but it touched on something I had been considering privately for months, uncertain how to articulate it even to those closest to me. "I'm thinking about psychology," I said, watching the flames rather than meeting anyone's eyes, maybe with a focus on trauma and resilience. The connection to my own experience hung unspoken in the air, but Theo's mother nodded thoughtfully. "That's a growing field, especially with what we know now about how trauma affects the brain, how people recover from extreme experiences." "Exactly," I agreed, relieved by her matter-of-fact response. "I've been reading a lot about it this year, and it's fascinating how different people process the same types of events, how some develop PTSD while others show what they call post-traumatic growth. "And which category do you fall into?" Theo's father asked gently, the question more perceptive than I might have expected. I considered this, watching sparks rise from the fire into the darkening sky. Both, I think, at different times, different days. I paused, then added, "I'd like to understand it better. Maybe help others navigate it someday." The conversation moved on, but that moment, the quiet articulation of a purpose that had been forming gradually over the past year, felt significant. Vincent had sought to mold me into a reflection of himself, to perpetuate his distorted philosophy through my education. Instead, I was finding my own path, one that acknowledged the impact of trauma, but redirected it toward healing rather than harm. Later that night, lying in a sleeping bag on the cabin's screened porch, listening to the gentle rhythm of the lake against the shore, I thought about transformation, how experiences shape us, for better or worse. Vincent had been shaped by his own encounters with predatory behavior, had allowed that shaping to turn him into a predator himself. I was being shaped too, but with consciousness, with choice, with community that supported growth rather than exploitation. The therapist I'd been seeing, Dr. Karim, had talked often about narrative, how the stories we tell about our experiences influence our relationship to them. Vincent had tried to impose his narrative on me, to cast me as the protege in his distorted hero's journey. But the true power of story lies in authorship, in the ability to interpret one's own experience, rather than accepting another's interpretation. I was writing my own story now, one in which Pine Ridge figured prominently but did not define the plot. Vincent was a character in that story, but not its author or its central figure. And the ending, still being written, still unfolding, belonged to me alone. Sleep came easily that night, without the usual vigilance, without the reflexive checking of locks and shadows. And when I dreamed, it wasn't of boathouses or storms or pale faces watching through windows. Instead, I dreamed of open paths through sunlit forests, of clear water reflecting endless sky, of movement without pursuit. In the morning, I woke to birdsong and dappled light filtering through the porch screens. Theo was already up, making coffee in the kitchen with exaggerated carefulness to avoid waking the others. He grinned when he saw me, gesturing toward the dock where fishing rods leaned against the railing. "Sunrise fishing," he suggested in a stage whisper. "They're supposedly more active early." 20 minutes later, we sat side by side on the dock's edge, lines in the water, mugs of coffee cooling beside us. The lake was still, its surface a perfect mirror of the sky's gradual transition from pink to blue. Mist hung in patches over the water, dissipating slowly as the sun climbed higher. "It's been a year," Theo observed quietly, breaking a comfortable silence. "Since Pine Ridge?" I nodded, appreciating that he'd acknowledged the anniversary without making it the center of our mourning. "A long year. A good one, though," he suggested, glancing at me. "In some ways, at least." I considered this, weighing the fear and nightmares against the growth, the new awareness, the deepened relationships. "Yes," I agreed finally, "in some important ways." We lapsed back into silence, watching a heron stalk deliberately through the shallows nearby, its movements precise and patient. There was something meditative about its focus, its complete presence in the moment, neither dwelling on the past nor anticipating the future. I had been learning that skill, presence, over months of practice. The ability to recognize when my mind was sliding into hypervigilance or flashback, to gently redirect my attention to the immediate reality around me, to distinguish between the echo of past danger and the absence of present threat. "I had a thought," Theo said, after the heron had successfully speared a small fish and departed with its prize. "About Vincent." The name still triggered a physical response, a tightening in my chest, a slight acceleration of my heartbeat. But the reaction was milder than it once had been, manageable rather than overwhelming. "What about him?" I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. Theo hesitated, uncharacteristically cautious. You said he was fixated on teaching awareness, on making people see dangers they normally miss. He paused, then continued. But what if he was actually teaching the opposite? How to become the kind of person others should be wary of? How to hide in plain sight? How to use authority to bypass normal defenses? The insight struck me as both obvious and profound, a perspective shift that reframed Vincent's entire philosophy. He hadn't been training vigilant protectors. He'd been demonstrating predatory techniques while disguising them as protection. That makes sense, I said slowly. He wasn't creating guardians. He was creating duplicates, people who knew how to exploit the same vulnerabilities he exploited. Exactly, Theo agreed, warming to the topic. It's like he was saying, look how easily I can manipulate systems, gain trust, isolate targets. You could do this too, if you learn from me. The realization was simultaneously disturbing and liberating. Disturbing in its implication of Vincent's true intentions. Liberating in how completely it rejected the frame he had tried to impose on his teaching. So, when I refused to become his student in that sense, I began. You were actually demonstrating the real awareness he claimed to value, Theo finished. The ability to recognize manipulation for what it is, to resist it rather than internalize it. We fell silent again, contemplating this reframing of the Pine Ridge events. A fish tugged at Theo's line, and he reacted automatically, setting the hook and beginning the careful process of reeling it in. I watched, struck by the normality of the moment, the simple pleasure of sitting with a friend in early morning sunlight, discussing difficult truths, while engaged in an activity as ancient and straightforward as fishing. This, I realized, was reclamation in its purest form, not the absence of memory or the denial of impact, but the integration of experience into a life that remained fundamentally my own, neither defined by trauma nor ignorant of its lessons. Vincent would spend the next decade or more in prison, his movements restricted, his access to potential students severed. But even if he eventually re-entered society, he would find a changed landscape, camps with stricter hiring protocols, counselors subject to closer supervision, campers and parents more willing to report concerning behavior. His legacy, ironically, was the opposite of what he had intended. Instead of creating disciples who would carry forward his methodology, he had inadvertently strengthened the systems designed to prevent such exploitation. The awareness he claimed to value had indeed spread, not as hypervigilance or paranoia, but as institutional safeguards and educated caution. As Theo landed his fish, another base, smaller than yesterday's but still respectable, I felt a sense of completion, of a circle closing. Not an ending exactly, but a milestone in an ongoing journey of recovery and growth. The Vincent chapter wasn't erased from my story, but it was no longer the chapter I was actively writing. Nice catch, I said, helping Theo unhook the fish before he released it back into the lake. Your dad will be impressed. Nah, this one's too small for breakfast, Theo replied, watching the base dart away into deeper water. Better to let it grow bigger for next time. Next time. The simple phrase contained multitudes, the assumption of future visits, of continued friendship, of experiences that would build upon rather than merely repeat the past. The promise of growth and change, of moving forward without forgetting where I'd been. The sun had fully cleared the tree line now, burning away the last wisps of morning mist from the lake's surface. Beyond the dock, the day was taking shape. Theo's family stirring in the cabin, breakfast preparations beginning, plans forming for hiking or swimming or simply relaxing in the summer warmth. I cast my line again, watching it arc through the golden light before disappearing beneath the water's surface. Whatever lay beneath, whether fish or simply the peaceful absence of activity, I was present for it, attentive without anxiety, aware without fear. And in that moment of perfect balance between past and future, between memory and anticipation, I recognized the most significant lesson of the year since Pine Ridge, that trauma may change the landscape of a life, may alter its contours and redirect its rivers, but it need not determine its ultimate destination. Vincent had sought to define me through fear, Instead, I was defining myself through resilience, through the slow, steady work of reclaiming spaces, relationships, and possibilities that fear had temporarily placed beyond reach. Not as his student, but as my own teacher. Not as a reflection of his distorted vision, but as the author of a story still unfolding, one chapter at a time, toward a horizon limited only by my own imagination and courage. The water rippled beneath my floating line, a fish investigating the potential meal. I waited, patient and present, ready for whatever might come next.